It was December 18, 2004, when Jean-Luc Jossuat Vergès, a 48-year-old Frenchman, left his house without saying much. He lived in Vic-en-Bigorre, in the southwest of France. He only told his wife that he needed some time alone to think. He got in his car and drove to an old abandoned mushroom farm near Mataran. The place was filled with underground tunnels, dark and unused for decades. He took with him a flashlight, a bottle of whiskey, some sleeping pills, and a blanket. But what he was truly looking for in there was death. It was winter. It was cold. He entered alone, without telling anyone. He was depressed, disoriented, and ready to put an end to the emptiness he felt inside. Walking through narrow, unknown crevices, he advanced about 200 meters into the darkness. At a certain point, the flashlight slipped from his hand and went out. That's when everything changed. He was completely surrounded by total darkness. He no longer knew where he had come from or where he was going. No light, no signal, no food. And the worst part, he no longer wanted to die. Jean-Luc spent the first few days trying to escape the cave. He lost his shoes, soaked in mud, and called out, screamed, for help. He began using plastic tarps and old rags he found on the ground to stay warm. He slept wrapped in scraps however he could, always in the dark. The cold was constant, and the humidity seemed to seep into his bones. Days kept passing. He started drinking the water that dripped from the cave walls. And yes, he began eating mud, decaying wood, and even pieces of old paper, anything that had a texture different from stone. At certain moments, he later said, he even sang to himself, just to feel the sensation of hearing a human voice. Extreme hunger caused him to lose more than 18 kilos, nearly 40 pounds. He thought about taking his own life. He found a piece of rope, but the idea that he might still make it out alive started to grow inside him. Even there, in total darkness, with a wounded body and an exhausted mind, hope stubbornly refused to die. He was trapped in there for 35 days, alone, with no one having any idea where he was. On January 21st, 2005, 3 teenagers were exploring the area around the abandoned plantation. Classes had been suspended due to a teacher's strike, so they decided to play in the rural zone of Mataran. When they passed near the tunnels, they noticed a car that had been parked there for days. They found it strange. They told an adult from the village, who in turn alerted the authorities. A few hours later, rescue teams were inside the structure. Upon entering the site, despite the total darkness, they began the search and managed to trace the path Jean had taken. After passing through narrow and dangerous crevices, they finally reached him. They found Jean-Luc about 200 meters from the entrance. Weak, extremely thin, filthy, but alive. When the rescuers arrived, he was curled up, trembling, his skin pale and cracked. But he managed to speak. He said he survived by drinking water from the cave walls, that in the first days he tried to escape, but then gave up, that he thought he was going to die there, and then simply didn't. He was taken to the hospital, where he underwent rehydration and received intensive care. He recovered in just a few days and left the doctors astonished, not only for surviving so long without food, but for not developing any serious infections. He told his story to the French press shortly afterward. When asked what he used to think about during the dark nights, he simply replied, "I no longer knew if it was day or night. I just knew I was still breathing. If that's not a miracle, then what is?" The James G. Mitchell incident. On February 13, 1965, James G. Mitchell, 23 years old, set out with 2 friends in search of adventure. He was passionate about caves. That day was freezing, and snow was falling. Alongside his 2 friends, he headed into the Mannheim forest. Their destination was a nearly unknown cave, discovered by local teachers. They called it Schroeder's Pants Cave, a strange name for such a treacherous place. Upon arriving, they began preparing for the descent. Mitchell went first, tied the rope to a secure anchor point, fastened the harness to his body, and began descending. Inside, the space narrowed quickly. It was dark, wet, and freezing. The main shaft dropped over 20 meters. In the middle of the shaft, there was a small underground waterfall. Cold water flowed constantly. James wanted to examine a side opening, but something went wrong. The rope twisted. His body turned. James called for help. His friends shouted. James answered, but with difficulty. They tried pulling him back, but he wouldn't move. The rope was pulled at the wrong angle. Time passed, and the water didn't stop, hitting his chest, his face, chilling his bones, freezing his skin. He was trapped, his arm tangled, his torso pressed against the wall. The waterfall poured directly onto him, icy, relentless. His body temperature began to drop. James started trembling. Then his voice grew faint, until it disappeared. His friends ran for help. Within hours, experienced cavers, firefighters, and military personnel arrived at the scene. It was a difficult rescue. The rescuers began descending, tried to warm him up, tried to adjust the rope, but his body no longer responded. The rescue was impossible under those conditions, as the cave was too treacherous and had already begun to collapse. Removing James would have put others at risk. The rescuers returned to the surface and explained the delicate situation to his friends. In the end, they decided to seal the cave permanently, using stones. James Mitchell was dead. James remained inside for over 40 years. Only in 2006, with modern technology and specialized teams, were James's remains recovered. His brother, Bill, followed everything closely. And finally, he was able to bury him with dignity. Today, Schroeder's Pants Cave is avoided by everyone. It is remembered as a dark, icy trap, and James's death still stands as a brutal reminder of the dangers below the surface. A body suspended, trapped, underwater, no way out, and no warmth. The Mossdale Caverns Incident. On June 24, 1967, 6 young men prepared to explore a dangerous cave system in Yorkshire, England. All were experienced cavers, used to tight passages and long underground stretches. Among them was Michael Ryan, a 17-year-old boy passionate about adventure and geology. The cave chosen that day was called Mossdale Caverns. It was known in the community as one of the most treacherous in the country. The entrance was discreet, just a crack between rocks near Mossdale Scar. But inside, it turned into a maze of low tunnels, narrow curves, and crawling passages. That morning, the weather was cloudy but calm. No one imagined what was about to happen. With ropes, flashlights, helmets, and backpacks, the group began the descent. The plan was to explore one of the tightest sections, the far marathon crawl. It was so narrow they could barely turn their heads inside. The team moved in single file, slowly pushing through every inch. Outside, the weather changed without warning. A heavy rain hit the area earlier than expected. The limestone terrain quickly absorbed the stormwater, and that water started flowing directly into the cave. Down below, the air grew damp and heavy. The floor became slippery. Small trickles of water turned into rushing streams. Then came the sound, the roar of floodwater echoing closer. They realized what was happening too late. The cave was flooding. There was no time to turn back. The path they came through was already partially submerged. They tried to return, but it was impossible. Water rushed violently through the tunnels. They were trapped in the narrowest part of the cave with no way out. On the surface, no one noticed the group was missing for the first few hours. But by nightfall, concern set in. Rescue teams were called. Experienced volunteers rushed to the entrance of Mossdale Caverns. It was pouring rain. Visibility was terrible. The cave entrance already showed signs of flooding. Still, the rescuers decided to go in. They worked in shifts, crawling through the same tunnels the boys had crossed. The first day passed with no signs of the group. Then came the second. The rescuers advanced a bit further, but there were still strong water currents and many flooded areas. It was impossible to go any deeper, so they had to retreat again. Only on the third day did the water levels begin to drop. Then, the rescuers resumed the journey, crawling through narrow cracks and tight passages until they finally reached the far marathon crawl. And what they found there was devastating. Michael Ryan was still wearing his helmet. The headlamp attached to it no longer worked. All 6 were dead. Their bodies lay side by side, trapped inside the tunnel. They were just a few meters away from a slightly higher area, which might have saved them, but they couldn't reach it. Removing the bodies was extremely dangerous. The area was too unstable and narrow. After discussions with the families, a painful decision was made. The bodies would be left inside the cave. The entrance was sealed with concrete. Outside, a plaque was installed in memory of the 6 young men. It bears all their names: Michael Ryan, Jeffrey Workman, John Ogden, David Adamson, Terry Watson, and Colin Vickers. The tragedy shook the entire British caving community. It was considered the worst cave disaster in British history, and it led to permanent changes in safety protocols. From that point on, checking the weather forecast became a mandatory rule for any underground exploration. Today, Mossdale Caverns is seen as a tomb. No one enters anymore. Incident in the Riesending Schachthöhle cave. It was June 8, 2014, when 52-year-old German speleologist Johann Westhauser entered the Riesending Schachthöhle cave, located in the Bavarian Alps, southern Germany. He was accompanied by two colleagues. The cave, considered the deepest in the country, was a vertical labyrinth with more than 1,100 meters of depth and 19 kilometers of mapped passages. They had descended more than 1,000 meters below the surface when everything happened. Johann was leading the group when a rock suddenly detached from one of the walls. The stone struck his head with force. He collapsed to the ground, unconscious. When he regained consciousness, he was confused, weak, and showing clear signs of traumatic brain injury. At the bottom of the cave, there was no signal, no radio, no means of contacting the outside world. The place was narrow, full of uneven terrain, and had a temperature close to 3 degrees Celsius. One of his colleagues stayed with Johann, covering him with makeshift thermal blankets and trying to keep him awake. The other began a solitary ascent to the surface. It took nearly 12 hours of climbing through vertical tunnels, using makeshift ladders, slippery shafts, and tight passages where only one person could crawl at a time. When he finally reached the top, it was already dawn. He alerted the authorities, and the response was immediate. Rescue teams began organizing within hours. By the next day, more than 200 rescuers were on their way, many of them veterans of underground operations. In the days that followed, that number would grow to over 700 people involved, from 5 different countries: Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, and Croatia. All with one single goal: to get Johann out alive. The logistics of the operation were described as monstrous. The cave was so deep and treacherous that kilometers of wired communication cables had to be installed, since no radio signal could reach those depths. Metal ladders, safety ropes, anchor points, support tents, and even an improvised medical equipment transport system were set up inside the underground labyrinth. Each journey down to Johann's location required more than 10 hours of continuous descent through vertical shafts, narrow ramps, and dark chambers soaked in humidity. To keep him stable, rescuers worked in continuous shifts. They brought drinking water, high-calorie food, medication, thermal blankets, and portable heating systems. Johann remained lying down, conscious but extremely weak and vulnerable. There was a constant risk of infection, hypothermia, and fainting. The medical team that stayed with him set up an emergency care point right there, inside the cave. The rescue plan involved placing Johann in a special stretcher designed for extreme environments like that. The stretcher was secured with straps, padded with protective foam, and tied to suspension ropes. In the most vertical sections, it was hoisted using pulley systems. In the tighter tunnels, the stretcher was slowly dragged along slippery trails, barely wide enough for a lying adult. In some parts, it had to be turned sideways to fit, scraping against the walls of solid rock. At every sudden jolt, Johann cried out in pain. To allow rescuers to move forward, stopover and relay stations were set up, where teams could rest, recover, and take turns carrying the load. The rescue lasted exactly 11 days. And during that time, Johann's body temperature was monitored every few hours. In several critical moments, he had to be wrapped in sleeping bags heated with chemical packs to prevent his temperature from dropping too low. In other parts of the journey, volunteers faced internal waterfalls, muddy galleries, and slips that could have ruined everything. With every step forward, the risk was real. But they never stopped. On June 22, 2014, after more than 250 hours of operation, Johann finally emerged from the cave entrance. He was conscious, breathing with difficulty, but alive. He was immediately airlifted by helicopter to a hospital in Munich. He survived. The operation, estimated to cost over 1 million euros, was considered the most expensive and complex in the history of European speleology. Despite the risk, the depth, and the extreme difficulty, not a single rescuer was injured during the mission. Days later, once out of danger, Johann personally thanked the dozens of teams involved, one by one. This case went down in history as an extreme example of human resilience, international cooperation, and courage in the harshest of environments. Incident at Ogof Finnen Du Cave, Saturday, November 6, 2021. Civil engineer and experienced caver George Linnane, 38 years old, set out once again to explore the underground passages of Ogof Finnen Du Cave in Wales. The name means Cave of the Black Spring in Welsh, and it is the second deepest cave in the United Kingdom. A stone labyrinth filled with tight tunnels, abrupt drops, and flooded passages, stretching for more than 30 kilometers. George was not alone. He was part of a group of seasoned cavers familiar with the area. The expedition seemed routine. They were used to the treacherous terrain and fully aware of the risks. But that afternoon, in one of the cave's most remote and dangerous sections, everything changed. During the exploration, everything was going smoothly until George crossed a delicate area and suffered a fall of approximately 10 meters. The impact was brutal. He fractured his jaw, broke his collarbone, and sustained multiple fractures in his leg. His teammates immediately realized how serious the situation was. The spot where he fell was extremely inaccessible. Over 1 kilometer from the cave entrance, down a narrow and winding path. It was impossible to get him out quickly, and certainly not without specialized help. With no cell signal, one of the team members returned to the surface to call for help. The search for assistance was tense. The cave, extremely humid, narrow, and dark, was a true challenge. Even more so when someone is in distress and desperate to find help. The alarm was raised, and within hours, the rescue operation began to be mobilized. More than 300 volunteer rescuers from all over Britain took part in the mission. They worked in shifts, facing total darkness, narrow passages, and constant cold, bringing medicine, water, and food. When the rescuers finally reached him to begin the rescue, they immobilized George and placed him on the stretcher with some difficulty, as he had suffered numerous fractures. He was lifted out of the pit using pulleys and other tools. The team then began the journey back to the surface, facing many narrow, slippery, wet, and freezing passages. Despite all the challenges, they managed to transport George to the surface of the cave. It was 54 hours of nonstop rescue. 3 days of extreme tension. With every passing hour, the situation grew more delicate. But finally, at 8:45 p.m. on Monday, November 8th, George Linnane was brought out of the cave in an operation worthy of a movie, but entirely real. He was immediately airlifted to Cardiff University Hospital, where he underwent surgery and remained under intensive care. Despite the severity of his injuries, George survived. The cave was permanently closed, and no one is allowed to enter it anymore. Cave exploration can bring a mix of thrill, adventure, and adrenaline. But despite all of that, these places are extremely treacherous. The Plura Cave Incident, February 2014. The temperature in northern Norway was below freezing. The lakes were covered in ice, and the wind cut across the face like a blade. Still, 5 experienced divers from Finland were preparing for a mission that, to many, seemed impossible: to fully traverse Plura Cave, one of the most treacherous submerged cave systems in Europe. The team was made up of Patrik Grönqvist, Vesa Rantanen, Kai Kenkänen, Jari Uusitalo, and Jari Huotarinen. All of them were trained, experienced, and highly equipped. Each carried 7 compressed air cylinders, thermal diving suits, and used guidelines, a kind of nylon thread fixed to the cave to ensure the return path. The plan was to cross 2.3 kilometers of Plura Cave to the opposite side, at the Stein-Nugelflaget system, navigating through narrow passages, deep chambers, and dangerous curves, all underwater, in total darkness. For safety reasons, they split into 2 groups. Patrik Grönqvist and Jari Huotarinen entered first, and about an hour later, the other 3 divers followed. They entered the water on February 6, 2014, around 1 p.m. The first part of the dive went as expected. They were well prepared, moving in coordinated rhythm and respecting all the rules of technical cave diving. Plura Cave, though dangerous, was familiar to them. But the final stretch held a silent trap, an area known for extremely narrow passages, tight angles, and sharp rocks that could trap a diver if equipment was misaligned. That's where the tragedy began. In the last section of the crossing, Jari Huotarinen began navigating one of the final narrow fissures. It was a sharp elbow-shaped curve with reduced height and a real risk of entrapment. Something went wrong. Patrik Grönqvist, experienced and ahead, noticed Jari Huotarinen was no longer behind him. Realizing something was wrong, he turned back to help. The passage was so tight that the water flow created counterpressure, making it nearly impossible to retreat. The cylinders on their backs began hitting the walls, and mobility was lost by the second. Jari Huotarinen started swallowing water and slowly lost consciousness. Knowing he couldn't help and realizing he too was in danger, Patrik Grönqvist chose to move forward, completing the crossing, a decision that proved vital to his survival. About an hour after the first group entered, Vesa Rantanen, Jari Uusitalo, and Kai Kenkänen entered the water. Vesa, the third diver, came across Jari Huotarinen and also had to make a choice. turn back or complete the crossing. He passed by his friend and finished the route. Hari Usitalo was right behind. Upon seeing the situation, he panicked, became disoriented, and also ended up dying. The fifth and final diver, upon finding Jari Usitalo's body, turned back and did not complete the traverse, returning to the starting point. 2 divers completed the journey, and the 5th diver returned to the entry. After a period of recovery, Kai Kankinen drove to where they were staying. The group contacted emergency services, and the local police were notified. Police divers entered the cave and concluded that it would be impossible to recover the bodies without risking more lives due to pressure, temperature, and extreme complexity. They returned to the surface, and it was decided that the cave would be closed, with no possibility of retrieving the bodies. Kai Kankinen and Vesa Rantanen, unwilling to leave their friends behind, planned and executed the rescue on their own, without government authorization. 2 months and 20 days after the incident, they re-entered Plura Cave, determined to bring their friends home. Despite the danger, every move was calculated to the millimeter. After more than 10 hours of diving, they successfully brought both bodies back to the surface. Jari Usitalo and Jari Huotarinen were buried with national mourning. The international media reported the event as an act of extreme courage, but the divers themselves rejected the label of heroes. Kai Kankinen said in an interview, "I didn't go there for glory. I went there out of respect. They were our brothers, and you don't leave a brother behind." A story of courage, of loyalty, and of 2 friends who went back into hell to bring the other 2 home. The Nutty Putty Cave Incident. On November 24, 2009, John Edward Jones was slowly crawling through a dark, damp passage of Nutty Putty Cave in Utah. It was just 2 days before Thanksgiving, and he was with his brother in what felt like a nostalgic reunion. Nutty Putty Cave has narrow, vertical, and confusing tunnels, with a total mapped length of about 650 meters and a depth of 43 meters. Despite being relatively small, it's extremely treacherous. John had explored the cave as a child and wanted to relive a bit of his youth before heading home. Upon entering the cave, John decided to explore one of the lesser-known crevices. When he encountered 2 splits, he chose the narrower one, believing it would lead to a new chamber. He was wrong. That passage ended in a dead end and was only 25 centimeters wide. It was so tight that only a person's torso could barely squeeze through, and even then, with difficulty, he entered, pushing with his shoulders, feet, and steady breathing. He advanced about 6 meters and realized the space was narrowing even more. He tried to back out, but as he moved his hips to reverse, his chest became wedged against the rock. His arms had no room to assist in the movement. Each breath became harder. His chest was being crushed, and worst of all, he had inadvertently turned himself upside down, with his body stuck at a nearly 70-degree angle. Trapped head down, his body began to give in slowly to gravity. Blood started pooling in the upper part of his body. Internal pressure increased, and his organs began shutting down one by one. His face swelled. His lungs, compressed, couldn't expand properly. His heart beat rapidly, trying to keep blood flowing against gravity. It was a race against time, and John knew it. He called for his brother, who immediately went to get help. Soon, a specialized rescue team was at the cave's entrance. One of the most complex rescue operations in American history was about to begin. More than 130 rescuers were mobilized. They tried to dig a path from above. They used ropes, pulleys, tools. They built wooden braces to prevent the tunnel from collapsing. But nothing worked. The passage was so narrow that no equipment fit. No person could position themselves correctly without risking getting stuck too. Despite the pain, John remained lucid. He talked to rescuers, who were able to reach a safe distance to speak with him. One firefighter managed to hold his hand. John said he didn't want to die, that he loved his wife, that he wanted to see his daughter grow up. Then, at the most delicate moment of the operation, the pulley system gave out. One of the devices supporting the rescue structure broke irreversibly. The crevice was too unstable. When they tried to pull him out, the system failed, and John's body slid even deeper. The pain worsened. The pressure intensified. At that point, his body was already on the verge of collapse. After more than 27 hours trapped, unable to move, with his body crushed and blood pooling, John Edward Jones stopped responding. His heart couldn't take it. He died there, at the bottom of Nutty Putty Cave, fully aware of his fate, knowing no one would be able to get him out. It was a slow, painful, and lonely death. But perhaps the most macabre part came after. No subsequent attempt to remove his body succeeded. The risks were too high and could result in more deaths. So, officials made a drastic decision. Nutty Putty Cave was permanently sealed with concrete. John's body remains there to this day, trapped in the same spot where he spent nearly 30 hours. He never came out, buried alive. That cave is no longer a tourist site. It became a tomb of stone, silence, and tragedy, where a man was swallowed by his own curiosity and never returned. Incident in the Riesending Schachthöhle cave. It was June 8, 2014, when 52-year-old German speleologist Johann Westhauser entered the Riesending Schachthöhle cave, located in the Bavarian Alps, southern Germany. He was accompanied by two colleagues. The cave, considered the deepest in the country, was a vertical labyrinth with more than 1,100 meters of depth and 19 kilometers of mapped passages. They had descended more than 1,000 meters below the surface when everything happened. Johann was leading the group when a rock suddenly detached from one of the walls. The stone struck his head with force. He collapsed to the ground, unconscious. When he regained consciousness, he was confused, weak, and showing clear signs of traumatic brain injury. At the bottom of the cave, there was no signal, no radio, no means of contacting the outside world. The place was narrow, full of uneven terrain, and had a temperature close to 3 degrees Celsius. One of his colleagues stayed with Johann, covering him with makeshift thermal blankets and trying to keep him awake. The other began a solitary ascent to the surface. It took nearly 12 hours of climbing through vertical tunnels, using makeshift ladders, slippery shafts, and tight passages where only one person could crawl at a time. When he finally reached the top, it was already dawn. He alerted the authorities, and the response was immediate. Rescue teams began organizing within hours. By the next day, more than 200 rescuers were on their way, many of them veterans of underground operations. In the days that followed, that number would grow to over 700 people involved, from 5 different countries: Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, and Croatia. All with one single goal: to get Johann out alive. The logistics of the operation were described as monstrous. The cave was so deep and treacherous that kilometers of wired communication cables had to be installed, since no radio signal could reach those depths. Metal ladders, safety ropes, anchor points, support tents, and even an improvised medical equipment transport system were set up inside the underground labyrinth. Each journey down to Johann's location required more than 10 hours of continuous descent through vertical shafts, narrow ramps, and dark chambers soaked in humidity. To keep him stable, rescuers worked in continuous shifts. They brought drinking water, high-calorie food, medication, thermal blankets, and portable heating systems. Johann remained lying down, conscious but extremely weak and vulnerable. There was a constant risk of infection, hypothermia, and fainting. The medical team that stayed with him set up an emergency care point right there, inside the cave. The rescue plan involved placing Johann in a special stretcher designed for extreme environments like that. The stretcher was secured with straps, padded with protective foam, and tied to suspension ropes. In the most vertical sections, it was hoisted using pulley systems. In the tighter tunnels, the stretcher was slowly dragged along slippery trails, barely wide enough for a lying adult. In some parts, it had to be turned sideways to fit, scraping against the walls of solid rock. At every sudden jolt, Johann cried out in pain. To allow rescuers to move forward, stopover and relay stations were set up, where teams could rest, recover, and take turns carrying the load. The rescue lasted exactly 11 days. And during that time, Johann's body temperature was monitored every few hours. In several critical moments, he had to be wrapped in sleeping bags heated with chemical packs to prevent his temperature from dropping too low. In other parts of the journey, volunteers faced internal waterfalls, muddy galleries, and slips that could have ruined everything. With every step forward, the risk was real. But they never stopped. On June 22, 2014, after more than 250 hours of operation, Johann finally emerged from the cave entrance. He was conscious, breathing with difficulty, but alive. He was immediately airlifted by helicopter to a hospital in Munich. He survived. The operation, estimated to cost over €1 million, was considered the most expensive and complex in the history of European speleology. Despite the risk, the depth, and the extreme difficulty, not a single rescuer was injured during the mission. Days later, once out of danger, Johann personally thanked the dozens of teams involved. One by one, This case went down in history as an extreme example of human resilience, international cooperation, and courage in the harshest of environments. Incident at Ogof Finan Du Cave, Saturday, November 6, 2021. Civil engineer and experienced caver George Linnane, 38 years old, set out once again to explore the underground passages of Ogof Finan Du Cave in Wales. The name means Cave of the Black Spring in Welsh, and it is the second deepest cave in the United Kingdom. A stone labyrinth filled with tight tunnels, abrupt drops, and flooded passages, stretching for more than 30 kilometers. George was not alone. He was part of a group of seasoned cavers familiar with the area. The expedition seemed routine. They were used to the treacherous terrain and fully aware of the risks. But that afternoon, in one of the cave's most remote and dangerous sections, everything changed. During the exploration, everything was going smoothly until George crossed a delicate area and suffered a fall of approximately 10 meters. The impact was brutal. He fractured his jaw, broke his collarbone, and sustained multiple fractures in his leg. His teammates immediately realized how serious the situation was. The spot where he fell was extremely inaccessible. Over 1 kilometer from the cave entrance, down a narrow and winding path. It was impossible to get him out quickly, and certainly not without specialized help. With no cell signal, one of the team members returned to the surface to call for help. The search for assistance was tense. The cave, extremely humid, narrow, and dark, was a true challenge. Even more so when someone is in distress and desperate to find help. The alarm was raised, and within hours, the rescue operation began to be mobilized. More than 300 volunteer rescuers from all over Britain took part in the mission. They worked in shifts, facing total darkness, narrow passages, and constant cold, bringing medicine, water, and food. When the rescuers finally reached him to begin the rescue, they immobilized George and placed him on the stretcher with some difficulty, as he had suffered numerous fractures. He was lifted out of the pit using pulleys and other tools. The team then began the journey back to the surface, facing many narrow, slippery, wet, and freezing passages. Despite all the challenges, they managed to transport George to the surface of the cave. It was 54 hours of nonstop rescue. 3 days of extreme tension. With every passing hour, the situation grew more delicate. But finally, at 8:45 p.m. on Monday, November 8th, George Linnane was brought out of the cave in an operation worthy of a movie, but entirely real. He was immediately airlifted to Cardiff University Hospital, where he underwent surgery and remained under intensive care. Despite the severity of his injuries, George survived. The cave was permanently closed, and no one is allowed to enter it anymore. Cave exploration can bring a mix of thrill, adventure, and adrenaline. But despite all of that, these places are extremely treacherous. And you, would you have the courage to face an expedition like this?
The Alcatraz escape is one of the most intriguing in U.S. history, and to this day it raises doubts about whether the fugitive survived. Strong evidence suggests that the 3 prisoners who escaped did, in fact, change their identities and were never caught again. One of the most credible pieces of evidence that surfaced over the years was a letter received by the FBI in 2013, allegedly sent by one of the Anglin brothers. To understand why this case was reopened and how the prisoners planned the escape, stay with me until the end of this video. Let's go back to 1962. You're imprisoned on an island. Not just any island. A concrete fortress in the middle of the sea, surrounded by waters colder than 12 degrees Celsius, infested with sharks and with currents so strong that even Olympic swimmers hesitate. This island is called Alcatraz, the most secure prison the United States ever built. Or was. Because in 1962, 3 men vanished from there, without a trace, no bodies, no conclusive clues. To this day, no one knows for sure whether they died or managed to escape from something considered impossible. The mastermind behind the operation was named Frank Lee Morris. He had an above-average IQ, 133 according to prison records. Since childhood, he had been involved in crime, but what stood out was his calm, discipline, and ability to calculate every move. He had been arrested multiple times and had managed to escape from other prisons. When he was finally recaptured, they sent him to where they sent the irredeemable, Alcatraz. There, he met John and Clarence Anglin, brothers raised in a poor family in Georgia. They grew up swimming in cold Florida rivers and, unlike most inmates, had an absurd resistance to cold. They were also there for bank robbery, but they were discreet, hard-working, and shared Frank's desire to escape. Alongside them was Alan West, the fourth member of the group. He was the one who first discovered the secret route, a disused ventilation area behind the cells in Block B. From there, the plan began to take shape. For 7 months, they dug through the cell walls using spoons, sandpaper, metal scraps, and a stolen electric motor turned into a drill. The walls were weakened by the island's moisture and salt, which made the job easier. They progressed a few centimeters each night, always during the quietest hours in the prison. To avoid being caught, they hid the debris in their pants or pockets and discarded it little by little in the yard, disguised with natural dust. The back of the cells led to a narrow maintenance corridor used only by staff, and there they hid tools, raft pieces, paddles, and improvised equipment. And the disguises? This was one of the plan's most brilliant elements. Knowing that guards did nightly inspections, each inmate built a fake head out of papier-mâché, soap, cement, and real human hair. The heads were so convincing, they are now preserved in museums. The hair was collected from the prison barbershop with the help of fellow inmates. The heads were placed on fake pillows, with towels wrapped to simulate body contours. When guards walked by, they saw the inmate sleeping on their side, face turned to the wall. A simple but effective trick. But what really makes this story unbelievable is the plan to escape the island. They knew breaking out of the cells wasn't enough. Alcatraz was nearly 2.5 kilometers from the mainland, and the water was cold enough to cause hypothermia in under 20 minutes. So, they began stealing prison-issued raincoats, little by little, from the storeroom. They used over 50 coats, stitched together with laundry thread and glued using a paste made from toothpaste, soap, and paper. The inflatable raft was secretly tested in a hidden area of the prison. Yes, they managed to inflate it using a hand blower made from accordion parts stolen from the prison band. The paddles were made from plywood taken from baseboards and broken tools. Every part of the plan carried extreme risks. They had to dig for hours, hand-stitch materials, hide everything in a secret tunnel stash, and keep up a normal routine during the day. One mistake, and they'd be sent to solitary for an indefinite time. On the night of June 11th, 1962, with everything ready, the four men put the plan into action. Frank, John, and Clarence made it through the hole in their cells and reached the maintenance tunnel. But Alan West got stuck. He had sealed the fake grill with so much cement that he couldn't remove it. He tried for over an hour, but couldn't get through. When he finally opened the passage, the others were already gone. The three who made it climbed onto the roof, slid down external pipes, crossed the yard, and reached the island's edge. There, they inflated the handmade raft and vanished into the sea around 10 p.m. The next morning, a guard noticed that Frank hadn't woken up. He called out, got no response. When he shined his flashlight, he saw the fake head on the pillow. It rolled and fell to the floor. The alarm was raised immediately. The entire prison went into lockdown. The FBI, Navy, Coast Guard, and even helicopters joined the search. They found a floating paddle, pieces of raincoat near Angel Island, and a plastic wallet with photos of the Anglin brothers, wrapped in plastic. But no bodies. The mystery that was never solved. Officially, the FBI closed the case in 1979, stating the fugitives likely drowned. But there was no proof. No bodies washed ashore, and experts claimed that during that time of year, the sea was relatively calm and the crossing was possible with an inflatable raft, especially for people like the Anglins, who grew up swimming in cold water. And then, the clues started to emerge. Strange, unexplained. 1975, a family friend, Fred Brizzi, handed over a photo taken in Brazil. In it, two middle-aged men stand next to a plantation. He said he met the Anglin brothers in Rio Branco, Acre, and they asked not to be reported. The photo was analyzed by the military and forensic experts in 2015, with over 90% facial match probability. 1973, At the funeral of the Anglin brothers' mother, two men in suits and hats appeared, stayed at the back of the ceremony, cried, and vanished before the burial. Relatives swear they were John and Clarence. Witnesses confirmed the men seemed very emotional but wanted to remain hidden. Decades of mysterious flowers. The Anglin brothers' mother received anonymous flowers on important dates like birthdays. No one ever found out who sent them. In 2013, the FBI received an anonymous letter allegedly written by John Anglin, one of the three Alcatraz fugitives. In the letter, he claimed to be alive, 83 years old, and suffering from terminal cancer. He wrote, "I escaped from Alcatraz with my brothers and Frank Morris. I want to negotiate my surrender in exchange for medical treatment." The letter was sent to the FBI office in San Francisco and was taken seriously enough to temporarily reopen the case, something that hadn't happened since 1979. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive, but leaked documents from CBS News indicated that the letter's content aligned with long-standing suspicions that the Anglin brothers survived. Although the FBI never publicly confirmed its authenticity, it didn't dismiss the letter and left the case pending new evidence. For many, that letter is the greatest proof that at least one of the fugitives was alive more than 50 years after the escape, and maybe for a brief moment, he tried to return. 2015. A History Channel documentary showed an AI-enhanced forensic simulation of the Brazil photo. The results showed a very high resemblance to the Anglin brothers. The FBI said it wasn't conclusive, but never ruled it out.
The final question. Did they survive?
Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin managed to escape from the most secure prison in the world. That's a fact. What we don't know is, what happened next? Did they die in the freezing waters? Or did they cross the bay, reach the mainland, and disappear into a new life? Perhaps in Brazil, perhaps in Mexico. To this day, there is no definitive proof of death or life, only clues, and a silence that has lasted over 60 years. And meanwhile, the question still echoes through the empty walls of the former Alcatraz prison, now a museum. Did the perfect crime happen, and no one noticed?
Leave a comment, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button.
Have you ever heard of a documentary where real-life murderers reenact their own crimes? And even enjoy doing it? Sounds absurd, but it happened. And the most shocking part, they're not remorseful. They feel proud. We're talking about The Act of Killing, a 2012 documentary that shocked the world, and still can't be freely shown in Indonesia, the country where it all took place. But to understand why this film exists and why it's so disturbing, we need to go back in time. Indonesia, 1965. The country was going through a moment of political tension. The Indonesian Communist Party was one of the largest in the world, and that bothered the military. On the night of September 30th, 6 army generals were assassinated. The government blamed the communists and used the event as an excuse to launch one of the largest massacres in modern history. What followed was a real witch hunt. Paramilitary groups and armed civilians began arresting, torturing, and killing anyone accused of being a communist, or even just sympathizing with the ideology. Teachers, writers, students, rural workers. Anyone could be reported. Between October 1965 and March 1966, it's estimated that over 1 million people were murdered. No trial, no defense, no records, and the scariest part, no one was punished. On the contrary, the perpetrators were treated as national heroes. Decades later, an American filmmaker named Joshua Oppenheimer decided to return to Indonesia to investigate this dark chapter. But he did something completely different. He didn't interview the victims. He didn't look for survivors. He went straight to the killers. And what he discovered is simply unbelievable. One of these men was Anwar Congo, a former militia leader who bragged about killing over 1,000 people with his own hands. When interviewed, Anwar showed no guilt, no emotion. On the contrary, Intinke says, he laughed while describing the methods he used to kill. And then Joshua had an idea. He asked, "Yikits, if you could make a movie about your life, how would you portray these killings?" The answer? They agreed instantly. And thus, The Act of Killing was born. A documentary that not only interviews the murderers, but invites them to reenact their own atrocities as if they were in an action movie or musical. Yes, you heard that right. The men who killed thousands of innocent people put on costumes, build sets, rehearse choreography, and pretend to kill, smiling, as if they were movie stars. Some even compare themselves to Al Pacino and John Wayne. The experience is disturbing. The line between reality and absurdity begins to blur before your eyes. You see scenes with dancers, smoke, colorful lights, and, in the background, a simulation of a brutal execution. It's as if horror had been turned into spectacle, and they genuinely believe they're doing something grand. But what starts as a celebration gradually turns into something much darker. As the documentary progresses, Anwar Congo begins to unravel. As he watches himself in the reenactments, reliving the deaths, he starts to feel the weight of what he's done. For the first time, the smile disappears. The laughter fades, and at the end of the film, he vomits. He says, "Do I feel what they felt?" And no one answers. Not the director, not the audience, not even himself. The act of killing premiered in 2012 at the Telluride Film Festival in the United States and was quickly banned in Indonesia. There, the genocide has never been officially recognized. The killers still hold positions of power. Showing this film is considered an act of betrayal. To protect the Indonesian crew who worked on the production, Joshua used fake names in the credits, and he himself was banned from the country. Still, copies of the documentary began circulating secretly across Indonesia, on hidden DVDs, USB drives, and in underground screenings. The film was nominated for Best Documentary at the 2014 Oscars, won the BAFTA, and dozens of international awards. But what it left behind was more than just a cinematic work. It was a mirror showing what happens when a nation refuses to confront its past. And perhaps the most disturbing part is this: the monsters no longer hide. They're on stage, singing, dancing, and thinking everything is perfectly normal. Children of the Secret, Argentina's Lost Files. In the 2000s, filmmaker Lucia Mazza began investigating the lingering shadows of Argentina's military dictatorship, which between 1976 and 1983 persecuted, tortured, and killed thousands of political opponents. But her focus wasn't on the adults, it was on what happened to their children. Lucia discovered a group called Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, grandmothers searching for their missing grandchildren. During the regime, hundreds of pregnant women were kidnapped, held captive until they gave birth, and then executed. The babies were handed over to families connected to the government, the military, or the elite, under false birth records. She spent 2 years interviewing survivors, doctors who were forced to collaborate, and especially the young adults, who only later discovered they had been stolen from their biological mothers. The documentary was named Children of the Secret, but it was hard to find a network willing to air it. One of the most shocking scenes shows one of these children facing, for the first time, the police file of his biological mother, executed in 1978 after a forced birth in a clandestine center. The film also documents the case of Ignacio Guido Montoya Carlotto, who discovered his true identity 36 years after being born. He had been adopted by a high-ranking military officer and raised as part of the elite, unaware that he was the result of a state crime. During filming, Lucia began to be followed, and her studio was broken into twice. Hard drives disappeared. Even so, she managed to finish the film, thanks to backup copies sent abroad. Children of the Secret premiered in Paris in 2003 and only reached Argentina in 2005, shown in private screenings for victims' families. In 2006, an Argentine judge banned the documentary from being shown on public channels, claiming it conflicted with ongoing legal proceedings. Of the more than 500 babies stolen during the dictatorship, around 130 have been found and identified. The rest remain missing, and some may never discover who they really are. The ghosts of Unit 731, the horror, Japan, tried to hide. Unit 731 was one of the most secretive and brutal facilities in modern military history. Created by the Imperial Japanese Army in the 1930s, the base was located in Harbin, in northeast occupied China, and operated under the guise of conducting advanced scientific research, which in practice meant torture and mass murder. During World War II, thousands of Chinese civilians, Koreans, and Russian and American prisoners were taken to the unit, where they became human test subjects. The experiments included live dissections, amputations without anesthesia, freezing limbs, injecting diseases like typhus, cholera, and bubonic plague, testing biological bombs, and exposing people to chemical weapons. In 2001, British filmmaker Peter Williams decided to uncover the truth about the unit. With the help of Chinese historians and anonymous sources in Japan, Peter managed to track down former military personnel who had served at the facility. Some agreed to give interviews. In one of the most disturbing testimonies, a former doctor said, "Treating prisoners like rats was standard practice, but the worst part? We got used to thinking it was normal." The filming took place under tight security in cities like Kyoto and Osaka, as many of those involved still had ties to the government and prestigious universities. In 2003, Peter completed the documentary, naming it The Ghosts of Unit 731. The film was aired on the BBC with several edits and explicit warnings. In Japan, the film was never broadcast on any network. The Japanese government has never officially recognized Unit 731 as a war crimes operation. Many of the doctors and scientists involved were granted immunity in exchange for handing over their data to the United States, a deal now known as the Post-War Silence Pact. Some of those men went on to hold positions in universities and pharmaceutical labs until the 1980s. The documentary remains one of the boldest and most chilling records of what can happen when science is used as a justification for barbarism.
Let's start with the most dangerous outlaws, and as we move down the list, we'll get to the deadliest ones. Number 5. Clay Allison, the wild man of the frontier. Clay Allison wasn't just another gunslinger in the chaos of the Wild West. He was the chaos. The kind of guy you didn't want to cross paths with, not during the day, and definitely not at night. Born in 1840, he fought in the Civil War, but it seemed like the war never left him. After the conflict, instead of trying to live a normal life, Clay chose a different path, the path of senseless violence. And it wasn't just violence for money or revenge. He did it for pleasure. One of the darkest episodes of his life happened around 1870. A man named Charles Kennedy had been arrested, accused of multiple murders. The whole town wanted justice, but Clay wanted more. He gathered an angry mob, stormed the jail, and dragged Charles out by force. They lynched the man on the spot, but for Clay, that wasn't enough. He decapitated him with his own hands and carried the head like a trophy. And what did he do with it? He stuck it on a stake and placed it right at the entrance of the local saloon, like some twisted decoration. The head stayed there, in plain sight. Imagine kids going out to buy candy and running into that? But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Clay also had his bizarre side. He was infamous for riding his horse completely naked through town. Seriously, naked. The only thing he wore was his revolver. And no one laughed. It was pure terror. Now, get this story. A guy named Chunk Collar, who had already killed 7 men, kept saying he was going to take Clay out. So what did Clay do? He accepted a dinner invitation from the guy. Just like that. During the meal, Chunk tried to pull a gun and catch Clay off guard, but he hit the table and lost the upper hand. Within seconds, Clay drew his revolver and fired a single, perfect shot, right between Chunk's eyes. When asked why he'd sit down for dinner with someone who wanted him dead, Clay simply said, "Because I didn't want to send a man to hell on an empty stomach." That pretty much says it all about Clay Allison, a man with no fear, no limits, and not a shred of sanity. Number 4. Cherokee Bill, the ruthless outlaw. Crawford Goldsby, better known as Cherokee Bill, seemed like he was born to kill. He was the son of an African-American father and a mother of Native American and Mexican descent. That mix of hot blood and a turbulent youth gave rise to a monster who exploded way too early. By the age of 18, Cherokee Bill was already knee-deep in fights and shootouts. But things truly spiraled out of control when a man beat up his younger brother. Bill didn't hesitate. He pulled out his revolver and shot the guy on the spot. From that moment on, his life became a nonstop crime spree. He joined the Cook Gang, a violent crew that robbed banks, trains, and stagecoaches like it was just part of the routine. And Bill quickly became a key player in the group. In June of 1894, he killed a deputy. The next month, during 4th of July celebrations, he murdered 2 more people. 2 days later, another man. And he wrapped up the month with a full-on bank robbery. It was an insane streak of crimes, like he was racing against time. Cherokee Bill quickly became public enemy number 1, and the authorities didn't rest until they got him. In January 1895, he was finally captured. But even behind bars, he was still dangerous. Somehow, he managed to get his hands on a revolver and tried to escape, shooting at a guard in the process. The plan failed, and in March 1896, he was hanged. A big crowd showed up, expecting a dramatic speech or a last-minute confession. But no. His final words were cold and blunt. "I didn't come here to talk. I came here to die." Cherokee Bill was cold-blooded, fast, and deadly. In less than 2 years, he left behind a trail of blood that still shocks people today. Number 3. George Big Nose Parrott, the outlaw with the embarrassing name. The nickname didn't help at all. Big Nose, George. A name that made people laugh more than fear him. But behind that oversized nose was a violent, vengeful, and completely unstable man. George started his criminal career like many others of the time, by rustling cattle and robbing trains. But he wanted more. And in 1878, he decided to go big. He tried to derail a train and steal everything on board. The plan was bold, but it failed when a railway worker discovered the trap and reported it. Realizing his identity was about to be exposed, George fled with his gang. 2 highly skilled tracking sheriffs went after him, and both were killed. That turned George into one of the most wanted men in the region, with a bounty on his head worth the modern-day equivalent of over $600,000. When George was finally captured, he still tried to pull off one last move. He managed to get his hands on a hacksaw, hid it in his clothes, and spent days waiting for the right moment. He even snatched one of the jailer's keys without being noticed. When the day came, George started sawing through his chains during the early hours of the morning, slowly, carefully, so no one would hear. Everything was planned. His goal was simple: break the cuffs and escape at the perfect moment. But what he actually did caught everyone off guard. The next morning, as the jailer approached the cell, George was ready. With one quick motion, he threw the hacksaw straight at the jailer's face. The blow was sharp and unexpected. The jailer fell back, screaming, blood pouring down his face. George thought he had won, that the door would swing open and freedom was just a few steps away. But he didn't count on one thing: the jailer's wife. She saw the whole thing. She just happened to be there, maybe helping with something or bringing food to her husband. But the moment she saw George attack, she didn't hesitate. George was stopped immediately. Still, the town had had enough of waiting for justice. A mob stormed the jail and dragged George out by force. He was lynched right there on the spot. But the story doesn't end there. After his death, a local doctor decided to use George's body for a little experiment. He removed George's skin, made shoes out of it, and turned his skull into an ashtray. Creepy, right? But yes, it's all true. Those souvenirs are still on display in museums today. George Big Nose Parrott became a legend, not just for his crimes, but for literally becoming part of the local furniture. Number 2. Bill Doolin, founder of the richest gang in the West. If Clay Allison was the face of savagery and Cherokee Bill the symbol of impulsive brutality, Bill Doolin was the brain, the criminal mastermind. He wasn't just another outlaw of the Wild West. He was practically the CEO of crime. As the founder of the infamous Wild Bunch, Doolin ran what could easily be called a robbery empire. The gang formed around 1892, and in just 4 years, they pulled in over $5 million in cash and gold. That's worth tens of millions today. These guys didn't mess around. Every heist was planned down to the tiniest detail. Banks and trains were hit fast, hard, and with military-like precision. Just hearing their names sent towns into panic. But of course, all that attention came at a price. Law enforcement tightened the net, and one by one, members of the gang were either killed or captured. Eventually, Doolin himself was arrested, and it seemed like his reign had come to an end. But he still had one trick left. Inside the jail, Doolin somehow managed to get a weapon, no one knows exactly how, and held a guard at gunpoint. He escaped just like in the movies. But freedom didn't last long. Not long after, he was tracked down at a farmhouse. Lawmen surrounded the place and ordered him to surrender. But Doolin wasn't the surrendering type. He came out guns blazing. Alone, he took on 20 armed men. The result? He died in the shootout, but his reputation as one of the boldest and most dangerous criminals in history lived on. Doolin wasn't some reckless lunatic. He was cold, strategic, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted power, money, and respect. And for a while, he had it all. Number 1. Killer Jim Miller, the professional hitman. Now we've reached the top of the list. And it's no coincidence. Jim Miller, or simply Killer Miller, was the kind of man who scared even other outlaws. His coldness could chill you to the bone. You know the character who always wears black, speaks softly, and never misses a shot? That was him, in real life. Jim was different from the rest because he lived a sort of double life. In public, he was polite, religious, and even served as a lawman in some towns. But behind that front, he was a hired killer with a massive body count. It's estimated that he killed more than 50 people. Yes, 50. And the craziest part? He charged for each job like it was a regular service. The going rate? Around $150 back then, which would be about $5,000 today. Jim was extremely methodical. He always wore a bulletproof coat and was so fast on the draw that most of his targets never had time to react. He left no evidence, was never seen fleeing the scene, and only took jobs he knew he could pull off perfectly. But in 1908, he made a mistake. He was hired to kill a former deputy named Alan Bobbitt. Jim completed the hit, but left a witness behind. That slip cost him everything. He was arrested along with the people who hired him, and the entire town was up in arms. It was only a matter of time before the people took justice into their own hands. And that's exactly what happened. Before the trial could even begin, a mob stormed the jail, tied up Miller and the other three involved, and took them to a barn. It was classic Wild West-style lynching. The other three begged for their lives, screaming, crying. But Jim, he just looked the men in the eye and said, "Let's get this over with." Then, without waiting for anyone to push him, he jumped off the platform on his own. It was the coldest, most calculated, and quietest death on the list. Even at the end, he kept that same terrifying calm. A true cold-blooded killer.
Some people enter prison and never come out. High walls, maximum security, iron bars, and watchful guards. A place where freedom is nothing more than a distant dream. But what if someone decided to change that? Think about it. You're locked up with no way out, sentenced to 20, 30 years, maybe even forever. As the days drag on, a thought starts to grow in your mind. What if I escaped? And that's when the game of intelligence begins. Prisoners have plenty of time to think, and some of them think big. They observe everything: the guards' schedules, the cameras' blind spots, every tiny detail of the prison. For months, or even years, they devise plans so bold that they make even the best action movies look like child's play. Some jumped out of windows, others dug impossible tunnels, tricked guards, were rescued by helicopters, and even used fake heads to make it seem like they were still sleeping while they escaped. And the scariest part? Many of them succeeded. Today, you're going to discover the 4 most unbelievable prison escapes in history, cases that left authorities stunned, and the entire world wondering how on earth they were even possible. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Let's start from number 4 and work our way to the most incredible escape of all. Number 4. The Alcatraz Escape, the fake heads, and the perfect plan. The Alcatraz Escape, the impossible plan that worked? Alcatraz, the place no one was ever supposed to escape from. Located in the middle of San Francisco Bay, this prison was more than just a collection of cells and high walls. It was a symbol of absolute confinement. Surrounded by freezing waters, deadly currents, and sharks, at least that's what the guards like to say, Alcatraz became known as the Rock. The message was clear: if you come in here, you only leave in a coffin. But in 1962, 3 prisoners dared to defy the impossible. Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin knew that the only way out wasn't to wait for a miracle. It was to create their own escape plan. And that's exactly what they did. Months of planning. Every detail mattered. Every great escape begins with careful observation. For weeks, they analyzed the guards' routines, identifying patrol schedules, the exact moments of inspections, and even the sounds of the prison at night. Every noise, every step, every sliver of light was a detail that could mean the difference between freedom and death. After thoroughly studying their surroundings, they began to act. Inside their cells, they improvised tools using whatever they could find. Small spoons stolen from the cafeteria, pieces of metal, and even rusty scraps were transformed into instruments to discreetly and silently dig holes behind the ventilation grates. The idea was simple in theory, but incredibly risky in execution. Dig a tunnel small enough to go unnoticed, but large enough for them to crawl through to the other side. And so, night after night, spoonful by spoonful of concrete was removed, and the tunnels began to take shape. But that wasn't enough. They had to make sure the guards never suspected a thing. That's when they came up with their stroke of genius. Fake heads. The trick that fooled everyone. If the guards looked into their cells and saw an empty pillow, their plan would be exposed immediately. So, they created fake heads made of soap, toilet paper, and real hair, which they discreetly stole from the prison's barbershop. The level of detail was so impressive that, under the dim cell lighting, the replicas looked like real, sleeping faces. On the night of the escape, the three placed their replicas on their pillows and simply walked out of their cells like ghosts, completely unnoticed. Now, the hardest part was about to begin. The deadly crossing. The ocean was their final obstacle. After crawling through the tunnels to an access point in the prison's service area, the fugitives reached their biggest challenge yet, the treacherous waters of San Francisco Bay. Here, they faced a deadly dilemma. If they weren't fast enough, they'd be caught. If they were careless, they'd drown. But they had already planned for this. Using hand-stitched raincoats, they built an improvised raft reinforced with fabric scraps found in forgotten corners of the cafeteria. And this wasn't just any raft. They had tested the idea beforehand, checking the material's buoyancy inside the prison itself. Every little detail had been thought through. They knew they couldn't simply jump into the water. The tides were a crucial factor. If they left at the wrong time, they'd be dragged away and likely freeze to death before reaching land. So, they carefully calculated the exact moment, using the tide and the moonlight to guide their escape. The mystery that endures to this day. Did they make it? The next morning, the guards entered the cells and saw the prisoners sleeping peacefully, or so it seemed. When they took a closer look, they discovered the fake heads and went into a panic. Alcatraz had been defeated. The big question, however, remains unanswered to this day. Did they really escape? The FBI told the press that the three men had most likely drowned. However, no bodies were ever found, nor was there any trace of their improvised raft. Over the years, several mysterious clues have surfaced, leaving open the possibility that they successfully escaped. To begin with, just one day after the escape, a strange phone call was made to a lawyer in San Francisco. The caller claimed to be John Anglin and wanted to negotiate his surrender. When the lawyer refused, the call was abruptly cut off. Was it a prank or a real plea for help? But things get even stranger. For years, the Anglin brothers' mother received anonymous postcards and mysterious flowers on Mother's Day. And at her funeral, two tall women, heavily made up, were seen watching the ceremony. But they vanished before anyone could identify them. Disguises, perhaps? Additionally, witnesses reported seeing the Anglin brothers in Florida and Georgia. And in 1989, two bearded men showed up at their father's funeral, observed the body for a moment, and left without speaking to anyone. Coincidence? Or a silent reunion of fugitives with their past? And now for the most shocking detail. In 2015, a photo surfaced, supposedly taken in Brazil in 1975. It allegedly showed John and Clarence living peacefully. Facial recognition experts analyzed the image and concluded that the resemblance was highly probable. Could the brothers have escaped to Brazil and lived in peace for decades? To top it all off, an anonymous letter from 2013, attributed to John Anglin, claimed that Frank Morris had died in 2005, Clarence in 2011, and that John himself was battling cancer. He had lived in hiding all these years but wanted to surrender in exchange for medical treatment. The FBI analyzed the handwriting and DNA from the letter, but the results were inconclusive. So, the mystery remains. Did they survive or not? Are these clues just false hopes or evidence of one of the most successful escape plans of all time? To this day, this story divides opinions and sparks curiosity around the world. After all, sometimes reality can be even more incredible than fiction. Number 3. The Great Escape from Stalag Luft. 3. Tunnels, disguises, and a race against time. During World War II, one of the darkest periods in history, a group of Allied prisoners decided they would not simply wait for the worst inside Stalag Luft 3, a prisoner of war camp heavily guarded by Nazi soldiers. They were determined to do the impossible, escape the Nazi fortress by digging massive tunnels, in a top-secret operation that seemed straight out of a movie. The idea started to take shape when the prisoners noticed that, despite the intense surveillance, there were weak points in the camp structure. The soil in some areas was softer, and if they worked carefully, they could dig without the guards noticing. But there was a major problem. How to hide the removed soil? How could they ensure the plan wouldn't be discovered before it was completed? That's when the ingenuity of the prisoners came into play. More than 600 men took part in the operation. A true team effort. They created 3 secret tunnels, named Tom, Dick, and Harry, digging them with the most improbable tools. Spoons stolen from the cafeteria, pieces of wood, and anything else that could be used without drawing suspicion. While some men dug, others discreetly disposed of the dirt, hiding handfuls of soil inside their pants and scattering it across the camp during casual walks in the yard. But the escape plan didn't stop there. The prisoners also forged fake documents, improvised Nazi uniforms, and even crafted replicas of civilian clothes to disguise themselves once they got out. Every little detail was carefully planned. They created oil lamps to light the tunnels, built makeshift ventilation systems, and even installed wooden rails to transport the soil more efficiently. After months of relentless digging, Tunnel Harry was finally ready for the escape on the night of March 24th to 25th, 1944. It was the perfect opportunity. 200 prisoners were ready to flee. However, the plan started going wrong from the very beginning. The big mistake that cost many their freedom. As the first prisoners crawled through the tunnel, they quickly realized a major problem. The tunnel exit was not hidden in the forest as planned, but instead opened into an exposed area covered in snow. This meant that each person who left behind visible footprints, something that, sooner or later, would raise suspicion. The escape continued quietly for a few hours until, when the 77th prisoner was about to exit, a Nazi guard noticed unusual movement on the ground and sounded the alarm. Within seconds, chaos erupted throughout the camp. The remaining prisoners desperately tried to flee, but they were captured before they could even reach the exit. Of the 76 men who escaped, only 3 achieved total freedom. The remaining escapees were hunted down over the following days in a relentless manhunt led by the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police. Hitler's orders were clear: capture or eliminate the fugitives. The cruel fate of the captured. When Hitler learned about the escape, he was furious and decided to make an example out of the prisoners to prevent any future attempts. Defying international laws of war, he ordered the summary execution of 50 recaptured prisoners. They were taken in small groups to remote locations, where they were brutally murdered by the Gestapo under the false claim that they had been killed while attempting to escape. It was a cold and calculated massacre that shocked the world when the truth came to light. The remaining 23 recaptured prisoners suffered a slightly less cruel fate, but were still severely punished. They were sent to concentration camps, where many endured torture and inhumane conditions. The only 3 prisoners who truly managed to escape were Per Bergsland and Jens Müller, who successfully fled to Sweden, and Bram van der Stok, who made his way to Spain. They were the only ones who lived to tell the story of how the escape happened and how they managed to survive. The legacy of the Great Escape. Despite the tragic outcome for most of the fugitives, the Stalag Luft 3 escape remains one of the most astonishing stories of resilience and ingenuity during World War II. It showcased the courage of the prisoners, who, despite facing almost impossible odds, were able to create and execute an incredibly sophisticated escape plan. The escape was so legendary that it inspired the classic film The Great Escape, 1963, starring Steve McQueen. Additionally, after the war, many of the Nazi officers responsible for the executions were tried and convicted of war crimes. To this day, Tunnel Harry remains a symbol of determination, teamwork, and courage in times of despair. The Stalag Luft 3 camp has been transformed into a museum, where visitors can see part of the original tunnel and learn about this incredible escape story. Even in the face of a cruel enemy, these men proved that the will to be free is stronger than any fence, any guard, or any wall. Number 2. Pascal Payet, the man who escaped through the skies. If escaping from prison is already something out of a movie, imagine doing it by helicopter, twice. This was the case of Pascal Payet, a French criminal who not only defied the walls of prisons, but made sure his escapes had a cinematic touch. First escape, hijacking a helicopter. The first escape happened in 2001, when Pascal was imprisoned in a maximum security facility in southern France. He was considered a high-risk criminal, convicted for his role in an armored truck heist that resulted in murder. And he knew that if he wanted to be a free man again, he needed a spectacular plan. The plan was brilliant from the very beginning. His accomplices spent months studying the prison, analyzing the guards' routines, patrol schedules, and most importantly, the airspace above the facility. They realized that if they acted quickly enough, they could get Pascal out before anyone could react. Then came the big day. A helicopter was hijacked from an aeroclub and flown directly to the prison. The pilot, who had no idea his aircraft was about to be used for one of the most audacious crimes in French history, was forced to fly to the facility. Now, imagine the scene. A regular day in prison, guards monitoring the inmates. And suddenly, a helicopter lands in the courtyard. Before the staff could react, Pascal and 2 other prisoners jumped aboard and took off. The guards were paralyzed. How do you stop an escape like that? Chase after them? Impossible. Shoot down the helicopter? The prison didn't have that kind of firepower. Within minutes, Pascal was gone, flying through the sky like the main character of an action movie. However, his time as a fugitive was short-lived, and eventually, he was captured again. But if there was one thing he had proven, it was that prison wasn't a place for him. Second escape, hijacking a helicopter. Once is insane, but twice? In 2007, Pascal was locked up in another maximum security prison, this time under even stricter surveillance. After his spectacular escape 6 years earlier, authorities knew he was a major flight risk and that if he had even the slightest opportunity, he would try to escape again. But guess what? He tried, and he succeeded. This time, an even more elaborate plan. Once again, his accomplices hijacked another helicopter and flew straight to the prison. But this time, the plan was even more daring. The hijackers wore hoods and were armed, making the situation even more intense. When the aircraft landed, Payet jumped aboard once again, and within minutes, he was flying toward freedom. Again, and once again, the guards could do nothing but watch in disbelief. It was unreal, the manhunt, and the end of his freedom. This time, French authorities refused to give him the chance for a third flight. They launched a massive international search, tracking Pascal across Europe. Eventually, he was found and arrested again. Now, his exact location is a tightly kept secret. To prevent yet another spectacular escape, authorities decided never to reveal where he is being held and constantly transfer him between prisons. And what happened to his accomplices? The people who helped Pascal escape weren't so lucky. Many were arrested and convicted for hijacking an aircraft, assisting a prison escape, using a helicopter for criminal activity. Stealing a helicopter once is already complicated, but doing it twice to rescue a high-profile prisoner? That caught the attention of law enforcement agencies worldwide. The impact and the new prison security measures. Pascal Payet's escapes forced France to rethink its prison security. After these incidents, authorities began installing steel nets over prison courtyards to prevent helicopters from landing. Thanks to him, no prisoner can count on an aerial rescue so easily anymore. But despite all these measures, Pascal Payet's story remains one of the most absurd and daring prison escapes in history. While most inmates dream of files hidden inside cakes or underground tunnels, he simply looked up at the sky and thought, why not? Number 1. Ted Bundy, the serial killer who turned escaping into an art. If there was ever a criminal who exploited the system's weaknesses to the fullest, it was Ted Bundy. He wasn't just a cold, calculating murderer. He was also a master of manipulation and deception. And if tricking ordinary people was easy for him, imagine how he managed to fool the police. Not just once, but twice. Bundy was charismatic, persuasive, and, above all, extremely intelligent. He knew that to escape prison, he needed to be creative. And that's exactly what he did. The first escape. The library leap. On June 7, 1977, Ted Bundy was being held at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Colorado, facing charges for his crimes. But unlike most prisoners, he had special privileges that allowed him to move around the courthouse without handcuffs. Why? Because before being recognized as a serial killer, Bundy was a law student and had insisted on representing himself in court. He used this trick to gain the trust of the guards and secure more freedom of movement. And that was the moment. He made his first bold move. While supposedly doing legal research, Bundy was inside the courthouse library, located on the second floor of the building. 2 guards were stationed nearby, but they weren't watching him too closely. After all, who would suspect that this calm, well-mannered man would try anything? Then, without hesitation, he stood up, walked calmly to an open window, and jumped. The drop was almost 7 meters. about 2 stories high. Most people would think twice before making such a risky leap. But Bundy wasn't like most people. He hit the ground hard, twisting his ankle. But he didn't stop, limping but determined. He ran as if his life depended on it. Because, in a way, it did. By the time the guards realized what had happened, Bundy was already gone. For the next 6 days, he wandered through the mountains of Colorado, evading the massive manhunt that was launched to track him down. But being a fugitive wasn't easy. With no food, no shelter, and an injured leg, he struggled to survive. Eventually, he was caught again, driving a stolen car. But that was only his first escape. The best was yet to come. The second escape, the ultimate deception. Bundy knew that staying in prison meant waiting for the inevitable. His conviction was getting closer, and if he didn't act fast, he would lose his last chance. So, for weeks, he studied every detail of his cell in the Garfield County Jail and came up with a plan that seemed impossible. He discovered a weakness that no one had noticed. There was a crawl space above the ceiling of his cell, just big enough for a thin man to squeeze through. And that's exactly what he worked toward. Using a makeshift saw, he began cutting a hole in the ceiling, carefully choosing a spot out of the guard's view. Every piece of debris he removed was hidden among stacks of books and papers, making sure no one noticed. But digging wasn't enough. He needed to test if he could fit. So, over the following weeks, he intentionally lost weight, refusing food to ensure he could squeeze through the opening. December 30th, 1977. The perfect escape. With everything in place, Bundy finally made his move. He waited for the guards to complete their rounds. Then he climbed through the hole and crawled through the ventilation system until he reached the warden's office. Now came the genius part. Inside the warden's office, he found a civilian outfit that had been left for repairs. He changed into the clothes, tidied his hair, and then casually walked through the prison hallways, completely unnoticed. Nobody questioned him. Nobody stopped him. By the time the guards realized his cell was empty, Bundy was already gone, driving a stolen car heading straight for Florida. The perfect escape and the crimes in Florida. This time, Bundy didn't waste time hiding in the woods like he had during his first escape. He knew he needed to be quick and smart. He stole money, used fake identities, and traveled across the country without drawing suspicion. A few weeks later, already in Florida, he rented an apartment under a false name and began living as if nothing had happened. But Bundy wasn't just an ordinary fugitive. He was a psychopath. Instead of laying low, he went back to killing. A new wave of horror. While still on the run, Bundy broke into a university sorority house, Chi Omega, and attacked 4 women, brutally murdering 2 of them. Just days later, he kidnapped and murdered a 12-year-old girl, committing one of his most horrifying crimes. By this point, police were desperate to catch him, and that's exactly what happened on February 15th, 1978. The end of the road, Bundy was stopped by a Florida police officer for a routine traffic stop. The officer noticed his suspicious behavior, asked for identification, and, realizing something was off, tried to detain him. Bundy attempted to run, but was quickly caught and arrested. At that point, he had nowhere left to go. No more escapes. After being convicted for his crimes in Florida, Ted Bundy was sentenced to the electric chair. This time, there were no more holes in the ceiling or open windows to jump from. On January 24th, 1989, he was executed at Florida State Prison, finally ending the reign of terror of one of the most notorious and manipulative serial killers in history. A criminal mastermind of escape, but his escapes remain among the most incredible and daring ever recorded. While most prisoners spend years planning escapes that never happen, Bundy simply jumped out of a window and outsmarted an entire prison system, and for a time, he almost got away with it forever. If this story were a movie, many people would probably say it was too far-fetched. But the truth is, Ted Bundy turned crime and escaping into a true art. What do you think? That brings us to the end of this wild journey filled with twists, daring plans, and escapes that seem straight out of a Hollywood script. But now, I want to hear from you. Which of these escapes impressed you the most? Do you think the Alcatraz fugitives actually survived? Could Ted Bundy have escaped again if he hadn't been caught in Florida? Let me know in the comments. And if you love mysteries, crime stories, and unbelievable escapes like these, Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video.
Prepare for a true journey back in time, where the methods of punishment were so unusual and macabre that they would make any horror series seem like child's play. Imagine yourself strolling through the dark streets of medieval London or sailing the seven seas as we unveil the 11 most bizarre and cruel forms of punishment that have ever existed. Fasten your seatbelt, or rather, loosen it, because what comes next will send shivers down your spine and, at the same time, draw nervous smiles of disbelief. Starting with number 11, the Iron Bull is one of those medieval inventions that seems to have come straight out of a horror movie, but with an absurd touch of cruel creativity. Imagine a metal structure in the shape of a bull, with its interior filled with recesses and sharp spikes, a true iron embrace, though nothing welcoming at all. In this device, the condemned was locked inside, and according to legends, the interior was heated, turning each moment into unbearable torture. The design was so peculiar that, in addition to the physical suffering, with the heat and the spikes causing excruciating pain, the very sound produced by the structure resembled the bellowing of an enraged bull. It is as if the condemned were eternally trapped inside a metal beast, crying out for mercy, while that disturbing sound echoed throughout the place. Continuing with number 10, the feared Dungeon of Rats. If you lived in London in medieval times, you would surely have heard rumors about this prison worthy of a horror movie, but without the popcorn part. In a dark cell hidden at the bottom of the Tower of London, the condemned were chained and left at the mercy of a fate that mixed claustrophobia with a parade of rodents. The craziest detail? This dungeon was directly connected to a river, positioned below the water level. Thus, when the waters rose, the rats, those little invaders from the banks, were forced to abandon their hiding places and, in a true aquatic sprint, swam straight to the door of the unfortunate prisoner. Just imagine, you, trapped in the dark, without even seeing the approach of the starving rodents, but hearing the sound of paws scratching the walls. In a matter of minutes, the party was underway, and the condemned went from being an innocent target to a moving banquet, receiving little bites until exhaustion or despair knocked them down. And thus, the nightmare continued for days or even weeks, depending on the crime committed. It cannot be denied. If you wanted a method of rehabilitation with an extra dose of terror, this would be an option, although undoubtedly not recommended for those who are allergic to rats or have a phobia of confined spaces. Climbing the scale of cruelty, we reach number 9, the infamous cavalet. Imagine a device that looked more like a crazy ladder, but with a very macabre touch. In this device, the feet and wrists of the condemned were tied to a system of pulleys, almost as if they were on one of those amusement park rides, but with no fun at all. 2 officers, or torturers if you prefer the term, slowly turned the ropes, increasing the pressure on the prisoner's joints with each rotation. The idea was simple: force a confession, even if the defendant ended up saying any nonsense just to relieve the pain. In some cases, this worked, and the prisoner left with their entire body contorted and full of misaligned joints, but miraculously with their life preserved. In others, the story did not have a happy ending, as in the case of Anne Askew, a young woman who, for defending her religious beliefs, faced hours of torment until she was taken to an even darker fate. The cavalet, with its spine-tingling design and functionality that resembled a human jigsaw puzzle mechanism, was certainly one of the cruelest amusements of medieval courts. Now, if you think that terrestrial punishment could not get any crazier, wait until you hear number 8, keel hauling. This practice was reserved for the troublemakers of the seas, sailors who dared to steal or treat their fellow crew members as if they were toys. Everything began with the sailor having his arms tied and a rope being stretched around the hull of the ship, binding his feet. Then he was thrown into the sea, and, while the crew pulled the rope, the condemned was dragged along the bottom of the ship, passing very close to the feared keel, that sharp part full of shellfish and barnacles that, if it did not kill him immediately, would guarantee some good scar souvenirs. Depending on the mood or strength of the fellow crew members, the sailor might die in the middle of the journey, be thrown back onto the ship for a slow and painful agony, or, in a stroke of both luck and misfortune, manage to survive, but with marks that would be the subject of jokes for a lifetime. Imagine having a sea story that no one else dares to tell without nervously laughing. Moving on to number 7. Macabre creativity reaches epic proportions with crushed by elephants. This punishment was not for the faint of heart. Originating from traditions that spread across several countries, but most notably practiced in 19th century India, this form of punishment took the idea of trampling to a new level. Basically, if the defendant committed offenses ranging from not paying taxes to much more dubious crimes, he had the chance to be turned into a human carpet for the entertainment of the ruling elite. With the criminal's arms tied, or while lying down, an elephant, properly trained and controlled by a man who sat on it with airs of someone in command of everything, began the crushing process. There were various variations. In one, the condemned's head was placed on a pedestal, and, with the elephant's foot, he was crushed as if he were a grape. In another, the poor man was laid down, and the elephant made repeated attempts, sometimes leaving only a piece of what had been his body, all to guarantee a brutal spectacle and, for some, macabre entertainment. And if someone, by some miracle or misfortune, managed to survive the first round, the fate was even crueler, with repetitive executions or a life marked by scars and mockery that would make anyone prefer a prison without rats. From here on, the list only becomes more grim. At number 6, we have the feared impalement. Imagine a scene bordering on the grotesque. The condemned, lying face down and with his arms tied, suffered a strategic cut on the lower part of his body, where a paste, ironically made to stop the bleeding, was applied. Then, a long wooden stake, carefully prepared with grease, yes, grease to facilitate the insertion, was slowly pushed into the body. The executioner, with his hammer, delivered precise blows that drove the stake through the condemned, often emerging from unusual places such as the shoulder or even the head. After this performance, the body was stuck by the roadside, serving as a grim warning to anyone who dared defy the law. And, for some unfortunate souls, the penalty of impalement was not immediate death, but a prolonged punishment, where the condemned remained stuck to the stake, suffering as the passage of time and the onlooker's stares only increased the torment. Climbing to number 5, we find the enigmatic poina coeli, or penalty of the sack. This method was reserved for those who dared betray familial bonds. Yes, killing someone from one's own family was reason enough to receive this punishment, which originated in 2nd century Rome and reappeared in later historical periods, including in 18th century Germany. The procedure was as bizarre as the name. The murderer was placed inside a sturdy leather sack and, to ensure he was not left alone in this torture spa, a set of animals, usually a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, was thrown in along. After that, the sack was sewn from end to end and thrown into the ocean. Just imagine the scene. You get involved in a family mess, and the sack transforms into a sort of macabre surprise box. In certain versions of the punishment, the defendant even had the option, a rather ironic one, to choose between this aquatic adventure or being displayed in a coliseum, where his body would be torn apart in front of an audience hungry for violence. After all, having a choice is never so pleasant when both options are worthy of a medieval nightmare. We reach number 4, where the creativity or lack of mercy of the torturers reached almost unthinkable levels. Rat torture. This method, which makes our nerves tremble just at the thought, had 2 main versions. In the first, dated 1568 during the 80 Years' War, the prisoner was forced to have a rat placed in an upside-down clay bowl over sensitive parts of the body, such as the stomach or groin. To make matters worse, the bottom of the bowl was heated with torches or embers, causing the rodent, in panic, to start digging, and guess where? Directly into the condemned's flesh. The second version, which resembles a wild episode from a modern horror movie, was employed during Augusto Pinochet's regime. This time, the rat was inserted through a tube into the prisoner's rectum, where, desperate to escape, it ended up digging relentlessly, causing unbearable torture. In both cases, the torturer's objective was, in a perverse way, to make the prisoner suffer while being forced to, in a sense, collaborate with the animal's escape, a dynamic so grotesque that it borders on the comical if it weren't tragic. At number 3, the punishment becomes a public display of humiliation and terror with gibbeting, also known as the iron cage. This practice, which gained international fame through images published even in scientific magazines, was used to exhibit the condemned as living examples, or rather, post-mortem ones, of what happened to the disobedient. In various places, such as in the United States and, mainly, in England, criminals, from pirates to traitors, were locked in iron cages, molded in a way that uncomfortably and tightly fitted the contours of the human body. Then, these cages were hung at absurd heights, often more than 9 meters above the ground, so that any passerby would have the privilege of coming face to face with the condemned. Just imagine having to fetch water from a well and encountering a pitiful figure, hanging and begging for a sip of mercy. Undoubtedly, a macabre spectacle that would leave anyone sleepless, especially if the stench of decomposition accompanied the scene. At number 2, the punishment reaches a level of torture that seems to have been invented to test the limits of human endurance: scaphism. This technique, used by the ancient Persian Empire, transformed the condemned into a veritable feast for insects and crawling animals. The process began with the prisoner being tied on his back inside a type of boat, with his arms and legs exposed through strategically cut holes. But what seemed like a method of containment soon revealed itself as a nightmare. The individual was forced to consume large quantities of milk and honey, not intended to please the palate, but rather to provoke monstrous diarrhea. As if that were not enough, the rest of the body was equally covered with this sticky mixture, attracting a true invasion of insects, rodents, wasps, and flies, which delighted in the free meal. The relentless sun intensified the torment at the same time as the prisoner was forced to repeat this macabre ritual day after day, prolonging his suffering until, inexorably, death arrived, usually after 17 long days of agony, with his skin taken over by parasites and a look that would make any makeup artist cry. Finally, we reach number 1, the pinnacle of torment, the oubliette, the cell of forgetting. The name, coming from French, translates as to forget, and it is no wonder. Imagine a place so small, so claustrophobic, that the prisoner would not even be able to afford the luxury of sitting, lying down, or moving. This cell, often located in imposing castles, such as the famous Tower of London or Warwick Castle, was an invitation to oblivion, where the condemned were thrown in without ceremony and left to rot. The darkness was absolute and the space minuscule. And, in some cases, the condemned survived for years on crumbs of food and water, only to prolong the agony and transform oblivion into a punishment as long-lasting as time itself. By going through these methods, we realize that, despite all the brutalities, there was a kind of macabre creativity behind each punishment. Each technique, no matter how horrendous, reflected the spirit of an era where the spectacle of suffering was a tool of power and control. Perhaps today we would laugh at this invention of methods, but for those who lived in these dark times, the reality was so harsh that any relief, even if it was just the end of the torment, was a reason to celebrate life. This narrative, which mixes horror and humor in an almost surreal way, makes us reflect on the limits of human cruelty and how, from time to time, suffering was transformed into a macabre spectacle to frighten and discipline. On one hand, we entertain ourselves with the irony and exaggeration, but on the other, there is relief in knowing that such methods are, fortunately, confined to history books and horror movies, where, of course, the creativity of the screenwriters exceeds the limits of imagination, but without having to pay the price of reality. And so, between nervous laughs and shivers, we conclude our excursion through the darkest corners of historical punishment. A true lesson in perverse creativity, which makes us thankful for modern days when, at least, our punishments are limited to traffic fines and scoldings from bosses. Because, after all, if you had to choose between being dragged along the keel or being remembered in a tiny cell, who wouldn't prefer a written warning? In the end, this journey through the past teaches us that, even amidst extreme cruelty, human beings have always found ways to transform suffering into a spectacle.
The mind of a serial killer is one of the greatest mysteries of psychology and criminology. Some kill for pleasure, others for revenge, or even for reasons that defy logic. But there are cases where the behavior of these murderers goes beyond the ordinary, becoming true enigmas. Here are 5 cases of serial killers who defied expectations with unbelievable stories. The serial killer who won a reality show. Imagine watching a popular dating show on TV only to find out years later that one of the contestants was a brutal murderer. This happened with Rodney Alcala, later nicknamed the dating game killer. In the 1970s, Alcala participated in The Dating Game, a reality show where a bachelor or bachelorette asked questions to 3 mysterious contestants and chose one for a date. What no one knew was that Alcala had already committed murders before even stepping on the stage. Rodney Alcala was a handsome man with an air of confidence that made him charming. During the show, he smiled, flirted, and gave witty responses, winning over the audience and, most importantly, the contestant Cheryl Bradshaw, who chose him for a date. What no one realized, not even the show's producers, was that behind that charismatic smile hid a deadly predator. Alcala had previously been convicted of sexual assault and attempted murder, but managed to get out of prison on bail and resumed his life as if nothing had happened. However, Cheryl never actually went on the date with him. Something about him triggered an internal alarm as soon as she met him backstage at the show. He seemed strange, sinister. Something about him made me feel uncomfortable, she would later say. Her intuition may have saved her life. What the show didn't know was that Alcala was already actively killing women at that time and would continue doing so for another decade before finally being caught. Rodney Alcala was not an ordinary serial killer. He used his intelligence and charm to lure victims, often posing as a photographer. He convinced women to pose for him, claiming he wanted to capture their beauty for a professional portfolio. Some of these women were never seen alive again. He was meticulous and sadistic. He toyed with his victims, torturing them before killing them. When he was finally arrested, authorities found hundreds of photos of unidentified women in his possession, many of whom have never been identified. The scariest part? It is estimated that he may have killed over 100 people. His confirmed victims were strangled, beaten, and even sexually assaulted post-mortem. His method was extremely cruel. Alcala enjoyed bringing his victims to the brink of death, only to revive them and repeat the process multiple times before delivering the final blow. He was finally captured in 1979 when a missing woman in one of his photographs was recognized by a family member. The investigation revealed the extent of his crimes, and he was sentenced to death. However, due to appeals and case reviews, his sentence was postponed multiple times. He remained on death row for over 40 years until he died of natural causes in 2021. The killer who wrote letters to the police. Jack Unterweger is a rare case. A serial killer who managed to fool an entire society, portray himself as a model of rehabilitation, and return to killing without raising suspicion for a long time. His story is a chilling example of how intelligence and manipulation can be just as dangerous as sheer brutality. Born in Austria, Unterweger had a difficult childhood marked by abandonment and delinquency. His first known murder occurred in 1974 when he strangled a young woman with her own bra. He was sentenced to life in prison but shocked everyone by becoming a prolific writer behind bars. He started writing books, poetry, and even plays. His writings described his difficult childhood and supposed remorse, gaining the sympathy of intellectuals, writers, and even Austrian celebrities who pressured the government to give him a second chance. In 1990, after serving only 15 years of his sentence, Jack Unterweger was released under the justification that he had been rehabilitated. He was welcomed as a reformed man and became a public figure. However, while he was being celebrated by the media and invited to cultural events, he was already resuming his crimes. Now, under his new identity as a crime journalist, he began covering cases of murders and prostitution for Austrian newspapers. What no one suspected was that he was committing the very same murders he was investigating. His modus operandi had not changed. He strangled women with their own bras and left them in isolated locations. The most astonishing aspect was that Unterweger used his position in the media to divert suspicion. He even traveled to the United States to research crimes in Los Angeles, and during that trip, 3 prostitutes were found dead in the same manner as his victims in Austria. This caught the attention of the police, who started investigating him. When the connections between the crimes became evident, Unterweger fled, but he was captured in Florida and extradited to Austria. He was tried for 11 murders and sentenced to life in prison once again. However, before he could serve his sentence, he hanged himself in his cell using a noose made from his own clothes, the same method he used to kill his victims. The serial killer who sent riddles to the police. The Zodiac Killer was not just a murderer. He was one of the greatest criminal enigmas in U.S. history. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, a man began terrorizing California, attacking couples in secluded areas and sending coded letters to newspapers and the police. He called himself Zodiac and seemed to take pleasure in taunting the authorities, sending cryptic messages that challenged investigators to decipher them. The murders were brutal, and the killer did not follow a fixed pattern. He used different weapons and locations, leaving the police with no concrete leads. In one of the most disturbing cases, he attacked a couple in broad daylight in a park, wearing a black outfit with a mysterious symbol on his chest. He tied up the victims and repeatedly stabbed them, leaving behind one of the most terrifying crime scenes of his killing spree. His letters, written with an air of superiority and sarcasm, contained strange symbols and messages that were only deciphered decades later. In one of them, he claimed to have killed 37 people, although the police were only able to confirm 5 murders with certainty. His psychological game with investigators was so complex that, to this day, his identity remains unknown. Various theories have emerged, including suspects like teacher Arthur Lee Allen, but no definitive proof was ever found. In 2020, a group of specialists managed to decode one of his encrypted messages that had remained unsolved for over 50 years. However, the biggest mystery still lingers. Who was the Zodiac Killer? Could he still be alive, laughing at the police's attempts to find him? Or did he die, taking his secret to the grave? The genius of crime. Who became a cannibal? The story of Issei Sagawa sounds like the plot of a horror movie, but it is terrifyingly real. In 1981, this Japanese man was studying literature in France when he committed one of the most gruesome crimes ever recorded. He killed and cannibalized his classmate René Hartevelt in such a meticulous way that the police were horrified by the crime scene. Sagawa invited René to his home under the pretense of studying together. While she was distracted, he shot her in the head with a rifle. What happened next was even more grotesque. He not only violated her corpse, but also began cutting it apart and eating pieces of her flesh. He later described that he wanted to absorb her energy and that he found her meat soft and delicious. When he tried to dispose of the remains by placing them in suitcases, he was caught by the police. However, as absurd as it may seem, he never served time for his crime. Declared insane by a French medical report, he was sent back to Japan, where, due to legal loopholes, he was set free. The Japanese justice system had no way to prosecute him since the evidence was in France, and he simply walked free. The most outrageous part? He became a macabre celebrity. Sagawa published books detailing his crime, appeared on TV shows, and even acted in horror films. While many saw him as a monster, others treated him with a morbid curiosity, keeping him in the media spotlight for years. He lived freely until his death in 2022, never paying for what he had done. The killer who claimed to be possessed by a demon. In the 1970s, David Berkowitz spread terror across New York, becoming one of the most feared serial killers in the United States. Known as the Son of Sam, he murdered his victims with a .44 caliber revolver, attacking couples in secluded areas. But what made his story even more disturbing were the bizarre justifications he gave for his crimes. Berkowitz claimed that a demon spoke to him through his neighbor's black Labrador, named Sam. According to him, the animal was an evil entity that commanded him to kill. His letters to the police were filled with incoherent phrases and signed as the Son of Sam, which earned him the infamous nickname. The city of New York was gripped by panic. No one knew where he would strike next, and his ability to vanish without a trace made it difficult for the police to catch him. Streets became deserted at night, and couples avoided going out together, fearing they could be his next victims. Berkowitz was finally arrested in 1977 after police traced a parking ticket left near one of the crime scenes. During interrogation, he confessed immediately, But his explanation for the murders remained a mystery. Was he truly hearing demonic voices, or was he just making excuses to appear insane? Years later, he changed his story, claiming that his crimes were part of a satanic cult that required human sacrifices. This claim fueled countless conspiracy theories, but it was never confirmed. Still imprisoned today, Berkowitz now declares himself a reformed man, saying he has found Christian faith and that the demon no longer has control over him. These killers not only took lives but also challenged authorities and left behind mysteries that persist to this day. The Zodiac Killer was never identified, Issei Sagawa never paid for his crime, and David Berkowitz changed his story so many times that no one knows the absolute truth about his motivations. And you? Do you believe there are still other enigmatic killers out there who have yet to be discovered? Leave a comment below.
Did you know there was a time when being a baby was almost a public hazard? Not because of small toys or expired diapers, but because of grown-ups with diplomas who'd say, "What if we tested this on the baby?" Yep, science in the last century was a little too experimental, and their favorite targets? Babies, because, according to them, babies were pure, neutral, and malleable. Basically, lab rats with chubby cheeks. And the most famous case of all? The classic, Little Albert. Year, 1920. Johns Hopkins University Laboratory. Scientists, John Watson and Rosalie Rayner. Mission, find out if fear can be taught. How? They took a 9-month-old baby, who couldn't even say "Mom," and put him face to face with a white rat. At first, it was all adorable. Albert laughed, tried to touch the rat. It was super cute. Until the scientists started pairing the appearance of the rat with a deafening metallic noise, like hitting a steel bar with a hammer. The result? In no time, Albert started crying just from seeing the rat. Then he began crying at rabbits, dogs, whitebeards, fur coats, cotton. He basically became a walking panic detector. But the worst part wasn't even that. The worst part is that no one knows for sure what happened to Albert after the experiment. Some say he lived with trauma, others say he died young. Oh, and by the way, his parents had no idea it would be a traumatic experiment. They thought it was just an innocent test. Moral of the story? Always ask, "Test for what?" before signing any form. Now, let's spice things up. Literally. In the 1940s, a group of researchers wanted to find out if babies had a natural palate or if they learned to like things. And what was the best way to test that? Giving raw garlic, chopped onion, and lemon juice to babies under 6 months old. Because apparently, mashed banana is for weaklings. The scientists reported all sorts of reactions. Some babies made such intense faces, their eyes nearly disappeared, and others just ate it like mashed potatoes. One of them even licked the entire lemon. The conclusion? Taste can be learned, but some are born brave enough to face a barbecue. And here you are, doing gentle food introduction with mashed fruit. Now get ready, because what comes next isn't funny, it's disturbing. In the 1930s, in orphanages in the United States, like the one in Davenport, scientists wanted to study the effects of emotional deprivation. They literally split babies into 2 groups. One received hugs, affection, laughter, and emotional care. The other? None of that. Just the bare minimum to survive. Food, diaper changes, and absolute silence. No human contact beyond the basics. And guess what happened? Many of the deprived babies fell into total apathy. Some developed mental stagnation. And some died. Not from illness, but from the lack of human touch. A simple hug could have saved lives. And this was documented, published, scientifically approved. Now check this out. A human baby raised side by side with a chimpanzee. No, this isn't a Tarzan movie script. This really happened in 1931. Psychologists Winthrop and Luella Kellogg, yes, like the cereal, decided to raise their son, Donald, alongside a female chimpanzee named Gua. They wanted to know, would the chimp start acting like a human? But the twist? It was the baby who started imitating the chimp. Donald began barking, making strange noises, and even trying to walk on all fours. The experiment was cancelled after 9 months. Not because the chimp became human, but because the human was turning into a baby chimpanzee. And that wasn't the only time the line between science and crazy social experiment got blurry. In the 1970s, some researchers decided to study the effects of extreme sensory deprivation on babies. The idea was simple and disturbing. Leave babies in silent rooms, without color, without toys, without anything for long periods. They wanted to see if the brain would create its own stimuli. What happened? The babies started to show visible discomfort, then sadness, then complete apathy. Some developed emotional delays. The study was shut down when they realized they had invented infant boredom torture. But not all experiments looked bizarre at first. For example, in the 1960s, researchers created a project to test how babies reacted to human voices without seeing faces. So they used puppets with built-in speakers saying human phrases. The result? Confusion, crying, and pure terror. Because, really, is there anything scarier than an adult voice coming from a wooden puppet with staring eyes? Imagine being 5 months old and hearing, "Hi baby, let's play," coming from a box with a cloth nose. And speaking of strange sounds, another group of scientists, in the 20th century, decided to test babies' emotional reactions to extreme noises. They played metallic sounds, recorded screams, and even sirens close to the baby's ears. And the goal? To see their startle threshold. Because apparently, scaring a baby was a good way to study emotional acoustics. Some babies cried, others flinched, and some just froze. The study was stopped when parents began noticing their children tensed up at any loud sound, like a pot lid slamming. Now let's talk about one of the most absurd ideas in the history of science, the so-called natural language experiment. The theory was, if babies never hear any human language, will they invent one themselves? To test that, in the 13th and 15th centuries, yes, this goes way back, kings like Frederick II of Germany and even Egyptian monks ordered babies to be completely isolated. No one was allowed to speak to them. They were just fed. No touch, no voice, no affection. The result? No language ever emerged. But what did emerge were severe emotional problems. Many of the babies never developed normally. Some never even learned to speak. Yes, even medieval kings dabbled in the so-called science of silence. Adorable, right? Now, here's one that sounds like a joke. The cold bath experiments. In the Soviet Union, during the 1950s, it was believed that bathing babies in icy water would boost their immune systems. So they took newborns, dunked them into near-freezing tubs, and observed their reactions. Some screamed, others went into shock. But interestingly, in some cases, the babies adapted. This practice even became popular in some rural areas for a while. And you? Shivering just thinking about a lukewarm shower. And of course, how could we forget the case of David Reimer, one of the most controversial experiments of all time? David was born a healthy boy, but after a botched circumcision, his genitals were severely damaged. A psychologist named John Money, who strongly believed that gender is 100% social, convinced David's parents to raise him as a girl. They changed his name to Brenda. Pink clothes, girl toys, the whole package. John documented it all as a success story. But in his teenage years, David learned the truth, rejected the identity forced on him, and began living again as a boy. Sadly, he suffered deeply from depression and took his own life. A tragic experiment disguised as gender identity research. If you think you've heard it all, hold on, because when it comes to bizarre experiments on babies, human creativity seems to have no limits. And we're still sliding down that crazy staircase with style. Ever heard of the orphaned babies in the deliberate speech delay experiment? No? Well, this one took place in the 1940s in the United States, in orphanages. The theory was simple and sickening. Test whether a child's speech development would be affected if adults corrected their mistakes harshly, with stern tones, reprimands, even threats. Instead of hearing "good try," children heard things like, "That's wrong, very wrong, say it again." The result? Kids who were developing normally began stuttering, mispronouncing words, or avoiding speaking altogether. That's how scientists artificially created stuttering, and then claimed stuttering could be learned. Congrats, science, on the trauma. And if you thought that was heavy, wait until you hear about the induced malnutrition experiments. That's right. In the 1950s, a Canadian government-funded study gave Indigenous babies in public institutions food that was intentionally deficient in vitamins and minerals. Why? to measure the effects of malnutrition on child development. They wanted to know, for example, how long it would take for teeth to stop growing or bones to weaken. All of this was documented as if it were a plant experiment. But they were babies, real babies, who got sick, lost teeth, and lived with permanent damage. This remained hidden for over 40 years. Now let's talk about the infamous crying test. Yes, that's the informal name. In the 1960s, researchers wanted to measure how long a baby would cry without comfort. The method? Put the baby in a crib, leave the room, and time how long it took for them to stop. If they cried for 2 minutes, great. 20 minutes? Noted too. And they repeated this test at different times of day, over multiple days, with varying background sounds. Some babies gave up crying. Others screamed until they lost their voice. The scientists took notes, coldly. Conclusion? Some babies learned to give up faster than others. The famous learned helplessness. Ever felt like that as an adult? Well, it might have started in the crib. And let's not forget the swimming reflex tests, also known as, let's see if this baby can swim. Yes, really. In the 1930s and 40s, psychologists like Myrtle McGraw literally threw babies into swimming pools to see if the swimming reflex was innate. And believe it or not, some babies did move their arms and legs. Others swallowed water like they were bobbing in a punch bowl. And yes, it was all filmed, timed, and charted. Baby 3 kicked with right foot, sank after 4 seconds, burped a bubble. Sounds like a joke, but it was considered science. Chlorinated water, diapers, a stopwatch, and a clipboard. Now brace yourself. Infant electroshock experiments. Yes. In the 1960s, radical psychologists used mild electrical shocks on children, even babies just starting to speak, to correct undesirable behaviors. If the child said something wrong or made a random sound, they received a small electric stimulus to the skin, the kind of thing that today would land you in prison, on trial, in a Netflix documentary, or trending on Twitter. But back then, just another Tuesday in the lab. And to finish with a gut punch, let's talk about one of the strangest and most forgotten experiments in history, the Forgotten Babies of Sound. This study, done in Europe in the early 20th century, aimed to discover whether there was an original human language. So scientists completely isolated babies, ensuring no one spoke to them for months. Caregivers were forbidden to sing, talk, or make sounds. The idea was that, without external influence, babies might spontaneously create a new language. What happened? Silence. No language ever emerged. But what did emerge were developmental tragedies. Some babies were rendered completely mute. Many suffered severe social delays. Others simply didn't survive. Science hoped to hear a new language, but all it got was the sound of emptiness. These experiments, as unbelievable as they sound, really happened. In labs, hospitals, universities, orphanages. With official approval, with funding, with white lab coats. And the scariest part? Many of those scientists thought they were doing something brilliant. But in the end, what do we learn from all this? That the line between science and cruelty was once terrifyingly thin, and that babies, fragile, innocent, defenseless babies, were treated for decades as if they were just lab toys. And as shocking as it all is, maybe the biggest takeaway is this. Are we really that far from it today? Or did we just change the method and turn the trauma digital? So if you grew up with diapers, hugs, mashed bananas, and goofy music from Patati Patata, consider yourself lucky. Because some people started life as just another data point in a weird experiment. Let's start with number 6 and work our way up to number 1. Number 6, octopus. The octopus is one of the most intelligent animals on the planet, with 9 brains, 1 in its head and 1 in each tentacle. It's as if the tentacles have a life of their own and can make independent decisions. On top of that, it has 3 hearts and blue blood. Yes, blue blood, because instead of using iron to transport oxygen like we do, it uses copper. The octopus is so smart and cunning that it can make bold decisions, plan ahead, and think in incredible ways. Imagine being in a lab at night and suddenly seeing a trail of water on the floor, as if something had passed by. When checking the security cameras, you realized that an octopus, clever enough, had slipped out of its tank unnoticed, crossed the entire lab, opened the neighboring aquarium's tank, stole a fish, ate it, and then quietly returned to its own tank as if nothing had happened. In other words, it was smart enough to map the path in its mind, calculate the time it would take, and move stealthily. How many animals do you know that could pull that off? And this wasn't just an isolated case. It happened several times and was officially documented, including by the New England Aquarium in Boston, which has official reports of octopus night escapes. An octopus can hide and camouflage itself in an astonishing way. It can tuck itself under a shell, or even change its color and texture to blend in perfectly with its surroundings, just like a chameleon. It's capable of setting traps, solving complex problems, and even unscrewing jar lids. But sadly, all this incredible intelligence doesn't last long, as the octopus has a short lifespan, living only about 3 to 5 years. An incredibly smart creature, but one that doesn't stick around for long. Number 5. Crow. The crow has an incredible brain and a razor-sharp memory. It could easily be considered the Einstein of birds. Although it's often associated with horror movies, bad omens, death, and cemeteries, that's only because of its appearance. Its shiny black feathers and intense gaze make it easy to underestimate. But crows have deep emotions. They mourn the loss of family members and sometimes return days later, as if paying their respects. They are capable of logical reasoning. For example, dropping stones into a container of water to make food float to the surface. If you treat a crow badly, it will remember your face for up to 5 years. And worse, it will tell the other crows in its group who you are and how dangerous and untrustworthy you are. Scientists have even tested this by scaring crows while wearing masks. And years later, crows that had never even seen the mask before still reacted with fear, meaning the information had been passed down. If you're kind to a crow, offering it food, for example, it will remember you with affection and might even bring you little gifts as a thank you, like screws, buttons, or bottle caps. Crows have a unique communication system, sharing information, emotions, and even teachings. They can strategically hide food to trick other crows, teach tricks to their young, play with other animals, and carry colorful bottle caps just for fun. Crows have even been spotted sliding down snowy rooftops. Yes, they play and show emotions too. It's a shame they're so often judged by their appearance. Despite being incredibly intelligent, they are often ignored, chased away, and mistreated. Number 4. Dolphin. You've probably heard that dolphins are smart, that they can come up with ideas and learn tricks. But get this, dolphins can actually recognize their own reflection. In other words, they have self-awareness, something most animals don't have. Dolphins communicate through specific sounds, have friends, and share information. They can even pass down knowledge to others in surprising ways. When one dolphin is injured, others will gather to carry, protect, and comfort it in truly heartwarming ways. They care for and protect their young with incredible love and devotion. They're so clever that they'll toss a pufferfish back and forth to stress it out, making the fish release a special toxin that gets the dolphins high. And here's the wild part. They know exactly how much toxin to absorb, just enough to get buzzed without dying. After all, this toxin is powerful enough to kill dozens of humans at once. So the dolphin carefully shakes the pufferfish, absorbs just enough toxin to get a little loopy, and then relaxes. Dolphins live full emotional lives, filled with communication, feelings, and deep bonds. That's why they're considered some of the most intelligent animals in the world. Number 3. Elephant. If you've ever seen an elephant up close, you know just how imposing and intelligent these animals are. You've probably heard the phrase, "an elephant never forgets," right? Well, it's true. Elephants have an incredible memory and are capable of experiencing deep feelings and emotions. They easily remember routes, recognize other elephants even after many years, and feel emotions like sadness and longing. There's a touching story about 2 female elephants, Shirley and Jenny, who had briefly lived together in a circus but were separated for 23 years. In 1999, they were reunited at the Elephant Sanctuary in Tennessee, USA. Their reunion was nothing short of emotional. They immediately recognized each other and began showing strong, affectionate behaviors. Even after 23 years apart, they had kept each other alive in their memories. Elephants also protect their young, pass down knowledge, open gates, and can even paint on canvases using their trunks. They are capable of reasoning, coming up with ideas, settling disputes among themselves, and even mourning. Yes, they can sense when something is wrong, feel grief, and pay respects to a deceased elephant. Most elephants live beyond 70 years, which is absolutely incredible. They live in loving groups, forming deep bonds that can last a lifetime. Every reunion, every farewell, every celebration of birth, and every morning ritual reveals that behind all that strength and grandeur lies a giant heart, filled with emotions as genuine as our own. Number 2. Parrot. If you think parrots are only good for cursing and repeating funny words, you're seriously underestimating them. In reality, the parrot is one of the most intelligent animals in the world. They don't just mimic sounds. They understand context, associate words with emotions, and can make decisions based on the experiences they live. To give you an idea, a parrot's brain is so developed that its intelligence is comparable to that of a human child around 5 years old. These little feathered geniuses can learn hundreds of words, recognize colors, shapes, and even count small quantities. And it's not just about memory. They clearly show emotions like joy, jealousy, sadness, and anger. If you play with them, talk to them, and give them affection, a parrot will form a strong emotional bond with you. But if you treat them badly, don't think they'll forget easily. Parrots have an impressive emotional memory. They hold grudges and can become sulky, distant, and even refuse to interact for days or weeks. On top of that, parrots are extremely social creatures. In the wild, they live in flocks and build deep relationships. They need constant mental stimulation to stay happy, which is why they love toys, challenges, and, most of all, daily interaction. Ignoring a parrot is like leaving a child bored in an empty room. They feel it deeply, they suffer, and they can even develop destructive behaviors out of frustration. Number 1. Pig. Most people only think about pigs when it's time for a big barbecue, imagining a chubby, dirty animal rolling around in the mud. But the truth is very different. The pig is actually one of the most intelligent animals in nature. Seriously, it just doesn't get the credit it deserves because of its floppy ears and pink snout. Did you know pigs can solve mazes? Just like lab rats. And even better, they can learn tricks faster than dogs. There are pigs out there that can even play video games using a joystick. That's right. Scientists trained pigs to move a cursor on a screen using their snouts. And they learned all by themselves, through trial, error, and success. Practical, adaptable intelligence. And that's something not many animals can claim. And their memory? Incredible. They remember who treated them well, who didn't, and who they got along with. They feel empathy, anxiety, and they have social preferences too. They know exactly who they want to hang out with. Studies have even shown pigs pretending not to know where food was hidden, just so they wouldn't have to share. That's deception. That's strategy. That's high-level thinking. Pigs live in groups, communicate with different grunts, care lovingly for their babies. And yes, they have their moods too. Have you ever seen an angry pig? It's just like an angry person. They pout, grumble, and storm off in a huff. And the saddest part? Almost no one gives them the respect they deserve. People think they're just pigs. But behind that round body and clumsy look, there's a sharp brain and a heart full of feelings. Pigs are like that brilliant student sitting quietly at the back of the classroom, unnoticed. But if you give them a chance, you realize they understand everything. They were just waiting for the right moment. And that wraps up our list.
1. Snake Island, Brazil. Located about 35 kilometers off the coast of São Paulo, this island is a true tropical nightmare. It's home to between 2,000 and 5,000 golden lancehead vipers, one of the most venomous snakes in the world. It's so dangerous that the Brazilian government has banned all entry. Only researchers authorized by the Navy are allowed to set foot there. It's estimated that there's one snake per square meter. There are old reports of fishermen who accidentally landed there and never made it back alive. It's even said that the lighthouse keeper and his family died tragically after multiple snake bites. Today, the lighthouse is automated. No human lives there, and nobody wants to. 2. Global Seed Vault, Norway. In Svalbard, one of the coldest and most remote places on Earth, there's a bunker buried inside a mountain. It stores over 1 million seed samples from all over the world. This is humanity's backup plan in case of global catastrophe. Not even heads of state have unrestricted access. Only a tiny team under strict international control can enter. The vault is designed to withstand nuclear explosions, earthquakes, and even global warming. But here's the bizarre part. The site has already suffered partial flooding due to melting permafrost. In other words, even the Doomsday Vault is being threatened by what it was built to protect against. 3. Area 51, United States. In the Nevada desert, a road ends in signs that say, "Use of deadly force authorized." Satellites show runways and hangars, but officially, Area 51 doesn't exist. No civilian can enter, fly over, or even approach the base. Anyone who tries is intercepted. For years, the US government denied it existed, until they admitted it does, without explaining what goes on there. Theories include secret aircraft tests, reverse engineering alien technology, and even time-space experiments. The mystery only grew after leaks from ex-employees like Bob Lazar, who claimed to have worked on tech that wasn't from this planet. None of it was confirmed. But one thing's clear: no one gets in. And those who know too much disappear. 4. Lascaux Cave, France, discovered in 1940 by 4 teenagers. This cave holds some of the oldest artwork ever created by humans, paintings dating back 17,000 years. It was open to visitors for decades, but human breath and humidity began to damage the prehistoric drawings. Fungi and bacteria spread. In 1963, the cave was permanently closed. Today, only authorized scientists are allowed in, and even then, for just minutes under strict protocol. Most people will never see the original paintings. And maybe that's for the best. Preserving this glimpse into a distant past means keeping it hidden from the present. 5. North Sentinel Island, Indian Ocean. Part of the Andaman Archipelago, this island is home to one of the last uncontacted tribes on Earth. The Sentinelese have lived without contact with the modern world for over 60,000 years. Any approach ends in flying arrows or spears thrown from the forest. In 2006, 2 fishermen were killed after accidentally getting too close. In 2018, an American missionary tried to convert the natives. He was killed and buried in the beach sand. The Indian government has banned all approaches to the island. No ships or drones are allowed near. The Sentinelese want no contact. And finally, the world has learned to respect that. 6. Coca-Cola Secret Formula Vault, USA. Few people know this, but the Coca-Cola Secret Formula isn't stored on the cloud. It's kept inside a physical vault, located at the company's museum in Atlanta, Georgia. Only 2 people in the world know the full recipe, and they are never allowed to travel together. Nobody, not even the CEO, has access to the vault. In 2011, the vault was put on public display, but only from the outside. Its contents remain untouched. The world's most famous beverage holds a secret that not even billions of dollars can buy. 7. Dulce Base, New Mexico. In northern New Mexico, there's a small town called Dulce. But according to conspiracy theorists and former military personnel, there's a massive underground facility beneath it. They say it's not just a military base, but also a biological lab conducting experiments with human-alien hybrids. Alleged leaked documents suggest other species work side by side with American scientists across 7 underground levels. Of course, all of this is officially denied, but the airspace is restricted. And strange lights, black helicopters, and abnormal activity have been reported since the 1970s. If it's true, it's not just forbidden, it's unthinkable. Room 39. North Korea hidden inside an ordinary building in Pyongyang. Room 39 is considered the secret financial heart of North Korea's regime. According to defectors and international investigations, it coordinates illegal activities like drug trafficking, arms sales, dollar counterfeiting, and cryptocurrency mining, all to fund the lavish lifestyle of the country's. Very few people know exactly where the room is, and only the highest-ranking officials have access. Anyone who finds out too much vanishes. Literally. 9. Mount Athos, Greece. This peninsula is surrounded by Orthodox monasteries, a sacred place where time feels frozen in the Middle Ages. But here's the bizarre rule. Women have been banned from entering for over 1,000 years. Not even female animals are allowed. The reason is religious. The area is dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and no other woman may compete with her presence. Even male visitors need special permission, and only 20 are allowed in per day. Illegal entry is a federal crime. There have been cases of tourists trying to sneak in by boat, only to be intercepted by armed monks. Yes, armed monks. 10. Vatican Secret Archives, Italy. Imagine hundreds of kilometers of shelves holding documents on heresies, exorcisms, conspiracies, secret trials, and possibly even UFOs. The Vatican Secret Archives are off-limits to the public. Only scholars with direct permission from the Pope may enter, and even then, for a limited time and only a small section at once. Some documents are over 1,000 years old. Records from Galileo's trial, letters between popes and emperors, forbidden manuscripts, all locked away from public view. Officially, the Church says it's for preservation. But what's so dangerous in there that it can't even be scanned? 11th. Poveglia Island, Italy. Often called one of the most haunted islands on Earth, Poveglia lies near Venice and has served as a dumping ground for horrors over the centuries. In the 14th century, it was a final destination for plague victims. Thousands were left to die there and later burned in mass graves. In the 19th century, it became an asylum. Reports speak of lobotomies, abuse, and even a doctor who jumped from the tower claiming he was haunted by the souls of the dead. Today, visiting the island without government permission is forbidden. Vegetation has overtaken the ruins, and they say the air still carries the scent of suffering. Most who try to enter end up running away. 12. Heard Island, Australia. A desolate piece of land in the Indian Ocean, closer to Antarctica than to civilization. Heard Island belongs to Australia, but no one lives there. It's home to Mount Mawson, an active volcano surrounded by glaciers. Brutal storms, extreme winds, and an untouched ecosystem make the island nearly inaccessible. The Australian government bans visits without special authorization. Why? Because any human presence could disturb the pristine environment, which serves as a living lab to study climate change. It's like an alien planet within our own. 13. Niihau Island, Hawaii. Known as the Forbidden Island, Niihau has been owned by the Robinson family since 1864. They've kept it isolated, with no cars, roads, or electricity. Only about 100 native residents live there, speaking Hawaiian and maintaining ancient traditions. Tourists? Completely banned. Access is restricted even for other Hawaiians. Commercial planes can't fly over and boats can't dock. Occasionally, the Robinsons invite a guest or scientist. But otherwise, it's as if Niihau exists in another dimension, frozen in time. 14. Mezhgory, Russia. A whole town sealed off. Nestled in the Ural Mountains, Mezhgory is one of Russia's so-called closed cities. It doesn't appear on official maps, and access is guarded by military checkpoints. It's believed to house a massive underground facility beneath Mount Yamantau, possibly a nuclear bunker, or maybe an ultra-secret mining center. The Russian government confirms only that the town exists. The rest is silence. Rumors suggest it was built to shelter leaders during a nuclear attack. The Russian government doesn't confirm anything. It only admits that the city exists. The rest is silence. Rumors suggest the city was built to withstand a nuclear attack and to shelter the country's leaders in case of war. The population? Only government workers, bound by an oath of secrecy. 15. Men with Hill Base, United Kingdom. In the middle of the British countryside, Dozens of massive white spheres, looking like giant golf balls, form what is believed to be the largest electronic spying station in the world. Officially, it's a Royal Air Force base, but it's known to be controlled by the United States. It's believed to monitor phone calls, emails, messages, and even satellites from other countries. A silent, big brother. Entry? Forbidden. Contents? Classified. What's known is that the base is part of the Echelon Alliance, a global surveillance program. And if you're hearing this now, maybe it has already heard you first.
Imagine being born with a sharp brain, an elephant's memory, and the intelligence of a scientist, and still being treated as a symbol of bad luck. In general, the crow is associated with misfortune, often seen in cemeteries or believed to bring dark omens. It's linked to witchcraft, horror movies, and Halloween. It is hunted, ignored, and feared just for existing. And this happens every single day to one of the most brilliant animals in nature, a genius with black wings, a piercing gaze, and a brain that can recognize you even years after seeing you only once. You think humans are the peak of intelligence? Then maybe you haven't met the crow. Being born a crow might seem, at first glance, like something ordinary. A bird like any other, black with shiny feathers, a deep and strange call, and a presence that many find eerie. But anyone who's ever truly watched a crow knows it's not just another bird. In truth, being born a crow is like being born with a superpower, but a superpower that almost no one respects. While most animals go through life on autopilot, hunting, eating, running, sleeping, the crow lives in a different world. It thinks, it analyzes, it watches everything, and it understands more than you'd expect. And maybe that's exactly why being a crow, in this loud and distracted world, feels like a lonely experience. Because the crow doesn't just live, it perceives. The mind of a crow is like that of a silent engineer. There have been studies where it understands how a tool works just by watching. If it sees someone using a stick to reach food, it gets the logic, mimics the movement, and does the same. But it doesn't just copy, it improves the method. There was a crow that figured out if it dropped a pebble into a jar of water, the water level would rise and bring the food within reach. And it didn't do this once. It repeated the experiment, testing stones of different sizes, watching the effect of each one with the patience of a scientist. Some were too light, others didn't sink well. But it kept trying. It failed, corrected, and tried again until it found the perfect one. That's not luck. That's logic, applied reasoning, critical thinking. And honestly, there are many adults who couldn't even come close to this level of analysis. But the crow goes beyond intellect. It's aware. It notices. It memorizes. It remembers your face. If you were kind, it knows. If you were cruel, it knows that too. And it doesn't keep that to itself. It shares. Other crows learn from its experience. It's as if they have their own communication system, an invisible network connecting every member of the flock. And this isn't theory, it's fact. One well-known experiment proved this clearly. Scientists used human masks to scare crows near their nests. Years passed. And even after all that time, even with crows that had never seen those masks before, the reaction was the same. Fear, alertness, avoidance. The information had been passed down, from one to another. A collective, silent, precise knowledge. Something not even humans always manage. And even so, despite all of that, the crow still carries the weight of a bad reputation. And that bad reputation has nothing to do with what it is, but with where it shows up. Crows are seen in cemeteries, on roads with dead animals, in battlefields, in places where death has passed. Not because they bring death, they only arrive afterward. Because, like any intelligent animal, they take advantage of what the world leaves behind. But instead of seeing this as a skill, people chose to view it as a curse. They said the crow was a sign of bad luck, a dark omen, a messenger of tragedy. It became a character in horror stories, a symbol of witchcraft, the witch's spy. And that label stuck to it like paint. What the crow really brings is perception. It sees what others don't. It arrives earlier, notices more, understands better. And that scares people, because humans have always feared what is too intelligent, what doesn't obey, what lives outside the norm. And in the meantime, the crow keeps being underestimated. People who see it as just that dark bird have no idea that this is an animal that collects shiny objects, builds tools, hides food with strategy, and more than that, pretends to hide it in one spot just to fool whoever's watching. That's not just intelligence, that's cunning. It's theatre, it's information security, and there's more. Crows grieve. When one dies, the others don't just glance and move on. They stop. They stand in silence. They watch. They make low sounds, almost like a collective murmur. And it's not uncommon to see the whole group return to that spot in the following days, as if saying, "We remember." That emotional connection between them isn't symbolic. It's real and incredibly rare. Few animals show it so clearly, but no one talks about it. Maybe because the crow doesn't fit into the mold of what we call a charismatic animal. It's dark, its call isn't beautiful, its presence is too intense to go unnoticed. And yet, nobody wants to look at it for too long. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of prejudice, maybe because the crow doesn't play the role people expect from it. It doesn't sing to please, it doesn't dance to entertain, it simply exists and watches the world and everything happening in it. But it also plays, because the crow, despite all its logic, has lightness too. Have you ever seen crows tossing bottle caps into the air just to catch them again? Or sliding down snowy rooftops, climbing back up and sliding again like they'd discovered a secret amusement park? Have you ever seen crows teasing dogs just to see the reaction? They land nearby, peck around, wait for the dog to charge, and then fly away, laughing inside like they're saying, "Nice try." They don't do it because they need to. They do it because they enjoy it, because they take pleasure in interacting with the world, testing it, experimenting. And that bothers people, because the crow isn't predictable. It doesn't follow a script. It can't be tamed. It does things its own way. It thinks on its own. And it lives on the edges of what we understand. And in that space between what is and what seems, it carries a heavy burden. Being more intelligent than most living beings around it, but not being able to say anything. Being ignored, mocked, or feared just for being different. But sometimes, someone notices. There have been people who fed crows for days, asking for nothing in return. And one day, without warning, the crow came back with a gift. A shiny bottle cap, an old screw, a worn button. Small things, maybe useless to us, but filled with meaning. Because that was a symbol of recognition, a gesture, a quiet, "I know what you did." They don't speak, but they show. And that should be enough. But no one wants to listen. No one wants to give them space. No one makes a cartoon with a crow as the hero. It remains the creature of scary movies, the sign of the coming storm. And that is a shame. Because the crow might just be one of the greatest mirrors of who we are and what we don't want to see. It shows that intelligence doesn't always come in expected forms, that deep feelings don't require speech, and that when brilliance is born in the wrong body, in an unprepared world, it becomes loneliness. That's why it's a shame to be born a crow, because the world still hasn't learned how to deal with those who think too much, with those who feel too deeply, with those who watch in silence, but understand everything. And the crow still doesn't give up. It goes on, it flies, it remembers, it learns, and it watches everything from above, with a head full of ideas and a chest full of silence.